Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It was a strange feeling, one I couldn't shake. I had been walking down the old, deserted road when I first noticed it. The house stood there, isolated in the distance, its silhouette stark against the dimming sky. It was an old structure, something out of place among the modern homes that lined the town. The walls, cracked and decaying, looked as if they had borne witness to countless years of neglect. The windows, every single one of them, were sealed shut with thick wooden planks, no cracks or gaps to peek through. At first, I thought it was just another abandoned house. But then, something caught my attention. A faint glow. It wasn't much, just a flicker of light visible through the cracks in the boards. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for old houses to have people squatting inside, but the lights in the middle of the night were strange. I squinted, but nothing changed. The glow remained. Curiosity gnawed at me, pushing me forward as my feet carried me closer to the house. My breath started to quicken, a sudden unease creeping into my chest. The wind had picked up, howling through the empty streets, yet this house stood still. There was something off about it. Something that didn't belong. The nearer I got, the clearer the sounds became. Soft, almost playful. A child's laughter. It was high-pitched, innocent in its tone, but the longer I listened, the more unnatural it sounded. The laughter echoed off the walls, bouncing around inside, as if there was more than one child, dozens, maybe. But that didn't make sense. The house was supposed to be abandoned. I stopped in my tracks. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't turn back. Instead, I moved closer, compelled by some strange force, some curiosity I couldn't explain. I reached the front door, a simple wooden thing, worn and unkempt. The boards over the windows creaked and groaned in the wind, but the laughter continued. I raised my hand, almost hesitantly, and pressed it against the door. It felt cold. Too cold for a night like this. The wooden door, despite its age, felt solid, unyielding. Then, without warning, the door creaked open. I froze. My heart raced as I stared at the dim hallway inside. It looked so inviting. Too inviting. But it was also terrifying. The laughter was louder now, almost deafening. And that strange, flickering light still persisted from deeper within. I could turn around. I could leave, go home, forget this place ever existed. But something about that light, about that sound, pulled me forward. I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me, almost as if the house had made the decision for me. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. I turned to face the door, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. Just the growing sound of the children's laughter. And then it hit me. The house wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The door had closed so suddenly, so forcefully, that I could feel the air shift around me. The room was dim, lit only by the faint, flickering glow that seemed to come from nowhere. It was an eerie light, soft and warm, yet it did nothing to reassure me. If anything, it only added to the strangeness of the place. I turned slowly, scanning the hallway. It was narrow, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper that had once been a vibrant shade of blue but was now faded and cracked. The floor beneath my feet was creaky, and every step I took seemed to echo, as if the house itself were listening, waiting for me to make a move. The laughter was still there, faint, yet persistent, an innocent sound, yet it sent chills crawling down my spine. The house seemed to stretch on forever. There were no pictures, no furniture, just the long, empty corridor that led to God knows where. The walls felt too close, too confining, as if they were slowly closing in on me with every passing moment. I could hear the soft creaking of wood beneath the floorboards, and it reminded me of footsteps, slow, deliberate, but not quite human. I couldn't tell where the laughter was coming from. It bounced off the walls, making it sound like it was coming from every direction at once. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if the air around me had thickened. I took another step forward, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The light ahead of me was growing stronger, but it wasn't coming from any visible source. It was just there, like the house itself was glowing from within. Then, a sound, a soft rustle, came from behind me. My head snapped around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just a long, empty hallway. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. The laugh seemed louder now, closer. It was almost as if the children were right behind me, playing, laughing, teasing me. But I couldn't see them. The house was silent again, save for the occasional creak of the old wood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My legs felt heavy, each step harder than the last. I couldn't tell if the weight pressing down on me was physical or psychological. But it was there, pushing me deeper into the house, into its endless corridors. I reached a staircase. It was old, but with splintering in places, and the banister was crooked, leaning slightly to one side. The steps looked unstable, but I couldn't bring myself to leave them unexamined. As I placed my foot on the first step, the sound of footsteps from above froze me in my tracks. Slow, deliberate. The faint echo of each step made my heart race. There was someone up there. I took a step back, my hand clutching the railing, trying to steady myself. I opened my mouth to call out, but my voice failed me. The footsteps continued, coming closer, getting louder. But they weren't human. The sound wasn't right. It was too light. Too quick. And then there was a whisper, soft, barely audible, but it sent a wave of cold through me. Come play with us. I froze. The laughter returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the innocent sound of children anymore. It was mocking, twisted, as if the house itself was laughing at me, at my fear, at my hesitation. I turned toward the staircase again, my legs shaking beneath me. Something was up there. I could feel it. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen energy, as if whatever had been lingering in the house had now taken notice of me. I could almost feel its eyes on my back, pressing down on me. Without thinking, I took another step, then another. The staircase creaked under my weight, and the sound of footsteps above grew louder. But now, they weren't just footsteps. They were running. And then the laughter came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. Right beside me. I spun around. There was nothing there. But I could hear it. I could feel it. And that's when the door to the basement creaked open. Come play with us. The door to the basement swung open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The faint light from the hallway flickered, casting shadows that danced and shifted across the floor. I could hear the echo of the laughter, now blending with the sound of something scraping along the floor. It was a rhythmic sound, like the dragging of something heavy, but there was no sign of what it was. The invitation was clear, unsettlingly clear. Come play with us. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to go any further into this house, but my feet refused to obey. I felt like I was being pulled, dragged deeper into its heart. I glanced once more at the staircase, my only apparent escape, but the footsteps above were no longer just an ominous echo. Now, they were waiting. Patient. Almost predatory. I took a hesitant step toward the basement door, my body moving as if on its own, each motion more unnatural than the last. The scraping sound grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever was in the basement was inching closer, preparing for something. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath shallow, but still, I couldn't stop myself from stepping forward. The basement was pitch black. A vast, empty void beneath the house. The air grew colder the closer I got to the stairs. A cold that wasn't natural. It felt like it was coming from the very walls, as if the house itself was exhaling a long-held breath. I hesitated at the top of the stairs. The laughter had stopped. The stillness that followed was suffocating. Then, I heard a soft whisper. It was so quiet, almost inaudible, but it was clear enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Come closer. My hand shook as I reached for the railing, the wood damp and cold under my touch. I stepped down, my feet sinking into the darkness with each motion, the silence pressing in around me. The basement stretched out below, but the details were lost in the shadows. There was no light, no sound except for my own breath. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a hiss, and it was coming from below. The light flickered once more, and in that fleeting moment, I saw it. Just for an instant, just enough to make my heart stop, a shape crouched in the corner of the room. A figure, its features obscured, but I could see its eyes, two glowing, malevolent orbs staring up at me from the darkness. I froze. I couldn't move. The air was thick with an oppressive heat now, and the sound of the figure's breathing was too heavy, too deliberate. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut behind me. I gasped, spinning around. My heart was hammering in my chest as I pressed myself against the stairs, my back to the cold stone wall. The laughter erupted again, this time so close it felt like it was inside my head, filling every corner of the house. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The figure in the basement moved, shifting in the dark, its form contorting unnaturally as it approached. The scrape of its movements against the stone floor was deafening now, filling the silence between the frantic beating of my heart. The sound of footsteps, more than one now, rose from behind me. It wasn't the soft thuds of children anymore. No, these were heavier. More deliberate. Closer. It was like something was chasing me. Something was coming for me. I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me, my body too numb to react. The space between me and the basement door was closing, the walls growing tighter, as if the house itself was trying to trap me. You shouldn't have come, a voice whispered from the darkness. A voice not quite human. Too cold. Too deep. Now you're ours. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. The stairs seemed to stretch out before me, endless, as I pounded upward, my breath ragged. But the laughter was following me, growing louder, faster. It was right behind me now, close enough that I could feel the weight of it pressing on my chest. With a final push, I reached the top of the stairs. But the door at the end of the hallway, the only exit, was gone. The walls had shifted. The house had changed. I was trapped. I turned, gasping for air, but the hallway stretched on forever. The laughter was now a cacophony, a nightmare chorus, and I realized it wasn't just the house I was running from. It was them. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick and stifling. Every step I took seemed to echo through the house, louder and louder, as though the very structure was amplifying my fear. The laughter, no, the screaming of the children was unbearable now. It wasn't playful or innocent anymore. It was wild, frantic, and twisted, as though they were being torn apart from the inside. My head spun, trying to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't focus on anything but the suffocating atmosphere surrounding me. I turned around, desperate to find a way out, but the hallway was no longer the same. The door I had just come through, the one that had slammed shut behind me, was gone. In its place was a wall, smooth and unyielding. It hadn't been there before. It was as if the house had swallowed it whole. I touched it, my fingers brushing against the cold, featureless surface, but there was no way through. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be some escape. But every corner I turned only revealed more of the same, empty, decaying walls and shadows that seemed to follow me, always one step ahead. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. Something was moving behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the hallway was empty. No shadows. No figures. Just the oppressive silence. Breathe, I told myself. Breathe and think. The footsteps were getting louder again, closer this time. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the dim flicker of the light, I saw a shape. A figure standing motionless, its back turned toward me. It was tall, far too tall for any normal person, and its silhouette was shrouded in darkness. I froze. I knew I shouldn't approach. I knew I should turn and run, but something kept me rooted in place. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its eyes, if it had any, watching me. I took a hesitant step forward. And then, with a suddenness that made my heart jump into my throat, it turned. The eyes. Two hollow, black pits that swallowed the light, staring directly at me. No pupils. No expression. Just emptiness. The thing, whatever it was, took a slow step forward, its long, unnaturally thin limbs scraping against the floor with a sound that made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, the air around me growing colder, heavier, and I felt the walls pressing in once more. The laughter came again, but it was distant now, as if coming from all directions at once. The walls, the floors, everything was alive with the sound, pulling me in, drawing me toward the thing at the end of the hall. I needed to move. I couldn't think anymore. I turned and ran, blindly, not caring where I went, just knowing I had to get away from that figure. But the house was different now. The hallway twisted and turned, elongating before me, stretching endlessly. I couldn't find the door, couldn't find the exit. Every door I opened led to another hallway, another room that felt like a trap. And then, suddenly, I found it. A door. A real door, not like the others. The handle was old, but it turned under my grasp. I shoved it open, throwing myself into the room beyond. It was a child's bedroom, but it wasn't right. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, the same pattern repeating over and over, little clouds and stars, like something you'd expect in a nursery. But the bed was wrong. It wasn't a bed for a child. It was a small cot, covered in stains, the sheets twisted and torn as if someone had been struggling beneath them. And the air, it smelled of dust and mildew, but there was something else. Something sour. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room, desperate for any sign of escape. And then I saw it. A small, wooden toy on the floor. It was an old-fashioned rocking horse, chipped and worn, its paint faded from years of neglect. But what caught my attention wasn't the toy itself, it was the figure sitting on it. A child. A little girl. Or what was left of one. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes, they were wide, unblinking, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Her hair was matted and dirty, hanging loosely around her face, and her clothes were torn, as if she had been trapped here for far too long. But it wasn't her appearance that terrified me the most. It was the silence. The room was completely still, save for the gentle rocking of the horse. The laughter had stopped. The sound of running footsteps faded. The house, it had fallen silent. I took a step back, my heart racing. The girl on the rocking horse didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared. And then, her lips curled into a smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't innocent. It was something else entirely, something dark, something wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away as she slowly stood up from the rocking horse, her limbs moving at unnatural angles, her body jerking like a puppet on strings. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice hollow, distant. "Now you're ours." And in that moment, I understood. This house wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place. It was a trap. A trap for anyone foolish enough to wander inside. And there was no way out. The door slammed shut behind me, the force of it rattling the walls and sending a jolt of terror through my body. I spun around, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps, but the room I had entered was not the one I had seen moments before. It was darker now. The corners were filled with shadows that seemed to stretch longer, reaching out toward me like claws. The girl, she was gone. The rocking horse stood by itself in the corner, swaying gently in the stillness, but there was no sign of her, no trace of her eerie smile. I could still hear her voice in my head, soft, mocking. "Now you're ours." My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The house had changed again. The walls, the floors, the very air felt like it was shifting, closing in on me. I had to get out. I had to leave before it consumed me, before I became another part of its twisted, endless labyrinth. I turned, searching for another exit, but the room was small, too small. The only door was the one I had just entered through, but it wasn't the way out. I could feel it. There was no way back to the hallway, no escape from this room. The house was trapping me, tightening its grip. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, but not from the hallway. They were coming from above. Slow, dragging steps that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stay still. I had to keep moving, keep searching for a way out. I stepped cautiously toward the far corner of the room, my eyes darting to the shadows. That's when I noticed it. A crack in the wall, barely visible, but just enough for me to see something moving behind it. A shadow, long and distorted, like a figure that didn't belong. My heart skipped a beat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The footsteps above me grew louder, closer, and I could feel the vibrations in the floor as if something heavy was moving toward me. But that shadow in the wall, it wasn't moving like a person. It was shifting, like liquid, like it was part of the house itself. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the crack. It was cold, too cold. The air around it seemed to freeze, sending a chill through my body. Without thinking, I pressed harder, pushing against the wall. And then, with a sudden shift, it gave way. The wall split open, revealing a narrow passage behind it. I didn't hesitate. I bolted through the opening, the walls closing in behind me as I crawled into the dark passageway. It was narrow, tight, and I could barely see anything in the pitch-black darkness. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The footsteps were closer now, almost right on top of me, and I could feel the air grow heavier with each passing second. I had to move faster. I had to get away. The passage twisted and turned, and I lost all sense of direction. I couldn't tell if I was moving up or down, left or right. The walls seemed to shift, just like the rest of the house. Every time I thought I saw a way out, it vanished. And then, just as I felt I could go no further, I saw it, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. A door. It was my only chance. I crawled toward it, my hands scraping against the cold stone floor, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The footsteps above were gone now, but I knew they weren't far behind. I had to escape. I had to survive. I reached the door and pushed it open, stumbling into a room that looked like nothing I had seen before. It was an attic, dark and cluttered with old furniture and broken items. But what caught my attention wasn't the room, it was the thing in the center of it. A mirror. It was large, its frame ornate and carved with intricate designs. But the glass wasn't clear. It was fogged, obscured, as if something was trapped inside it. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. It was wrong. The face in the mirror wasn't mine. It was pale, distorted, its eyes wide and hollow. Its mouth stretched into a twisted grin, its features melting and warping like some grotesque reflection of myself. I stumbled back, horrified, but I couldn't look away. The face in the mirror didn't move like I did. It was locked in place, frozen in that terrible grin. And then, the laughter returned. It wasn't just the children now. It was everywhere, surrounding me, echoing through the room. It was the house itself, laughing at my terror, at my desperation. And then the voice came again. Soft. Whispers in the dark. "You're already one of us." I turned to run, but the door behind me slammed shut with a force that sent me crashing to the floor. The room darkened, the shadows growing deeper and darker. I could feel the walls pressing in, the air choking me. The house was alive. It had always been alive. And I had become part of it. The footsteps were right behind me now, too close to ignore. I could feel their weight, their presence. But there was no escape. There never had been. The mirror reflected my face once more, but this time I didn't look away. I smiled. It started with a simple ring. A sound so ordinary, so familiar, that it didn't immediately catch my attention. My phone lay on the kitchen counter, its screen flashing with an unknown number. I had been busy preparing dinner, chopping vegetables, stirring a pot of soup, but the ring seemed to pierce through the mundane tasks. I wiped my hands on a towel and reached for it, the screen still glowing as I pressed the green icon to answer. "Hello?" I said, expecting a telemarketer or some automated voice. But there was silence. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. The kind of glitch you get when the signal is weak, or perhaps I was just imagining things. But then, I heard something. It wasn't static. It wasn't the usual hum of a bad connection. It was my voice. "Is this?" The voice was muffled, like it was coming from far away. But it was unmistakably me. I froze. What in the world? "Is this the future?" the voice on the other end asked. The words felt absurd, yet the voice sounded so eerily calm, as though it had been rehearsed, as though it knew me intimately. I could almost hear myself, the slight lilt in my voice, the way I would normally phrase things. But how? I glanced at the phone again. The number was still unknown. My stomach twisted in a knot. I was about to hang up when my voice spoke again, clearer this time. "Listen carefully. The call is important. You need to pay attention." I swallowed hard, my hand trembling slightly. Who was on the other end of this call? Why was my own voice speaking to me? Was I imagining things? A strange feeling settled in my chest, like a mix of curiosity and dread. But the voice didn't give me a chance to speak, instead continuing with a sense of urgency. "Go to the window, right now." I stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, my mind racing. Was this a prank? Some kind of twisted joke? But then I heard a soft tapping on the other end, like the sound of a clock ticking, seconds passing by. The voice repeated itself, louder this time. "Go to the window." A chill crawled up my spine, and I did as it said. I walked slowly to the living room, my feet dragging, as if something was pulling me toward the window against my will. I reached the glass and looked out into the street, the familiar houses, cars, trees, all perfectly normal. But then, as I stood there, a shadow flickered in my peripheral vision. I snapped my head to the side, but saw nothing. The phone was still to my ear, and the voice spoke again. "It's coming. You can't stop it. But you can prepare." Prepare for what? I gasped, barely able to hear the words over the pounding in my heart. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it echoed, as if bouncing between dimensions, distant yet sharp, like a warning growing more urgent by the second. "Be careful tonight. Do not leave the house after dark. They're watching." And then the line went dead. Silence. I stood there, phone still in hand, staring at the screen, my mind spinning. Was I hearing things? Was this some sort of glitch, or something far more disturbing? My breath was shallow, my eyes flickering to the shadows outside the window, wondering if someone, or something, was really out there, watching me. But I couldn't just dismiss it. I couldn't ignore what had happened. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the phone still in my hand, replaying the voice over and over in my mind. Is this the future? The question lingered, unanswered. I tried to shake off the creeping unease that had settled into my bones, but it wouldn't go away. It couldn't. The voice on the phone had been too real, too familiar, and the warning was too specific to be ignored. I glanced at the clock. It was already late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the street. The idea of staying in the house after dark seemed strange, almost paranoid. But as the hours passed, a gnawing sense of dread only grew. The voice on the phone had been too clear, too certain. As the sky darkened and the house fell into shadows, I decided to follow the instructions. I stayed inside. I didn't venture out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching. I pulled the curtain shut, locked the door, and tried to distract myself with anything I could find, but it was impossible to ignore the growing tension that filled the air. Then, at exactly 8:30, my phone rang again. I almost didn't answer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But I couldn't resist. I grabbed the phone, holding my breath as I pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice tight. This time, there was no delay. The voice on the other end was quick, urgent. "It's happening now. They're outside. Don't open the door. Don't let them in." I glanced toward the front door, my heart racing. The silence outside was suffocating. No sounds. No cars passing by. Just the stillness. It felt wrong. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I waited for the voice to continue, but it didn't. The line went dead again. My thoughts raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was it real? I stood frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, as if expecting the voice to come back. But nothing. I could feel the weight of the silence in the house, pressing in from all sides. And then, almost as if the phone itself was a bridge to another world, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. A soft, deliberate tap on the door. One knock. Then another. Then a third. I stepped back, my body shaking, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The phone rang once more. "Do not open the door. Whatever you do, don't open the door." The voice repeated, but it was too late. I was already walking toward it. The knock came again. This time, I was sure I could hear something on the other side. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I reached for the door handle. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting. And no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. The door creaked open. The light from the hallway flickered. And I saw nothing. Just the empty air. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway, the silence swallowing me whole. My breath caught in my throat, the weight of the situation settling over me like a thick fog. I had heard the knocks, 3 distinct, deliberate taps, and yet, now that the door was open, there was nothing. No one. No movement. Just the stillness of the night. I looked down at the floor, my mind racing. Was it a prank? Some twisted, elaborate game? But then my eyes flickered to the phone still in my hand, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. The call had ended, but the words from the voice echoed in my mind. "Don't open the door." And yet, here I was, standing with the door ajar, unable to take my eyes off the empty space in front of me. I stepped back, my body trembling. My fingers tightened around the phone, but I didn't dare to close the door just yet. I needed to be sure. I needed to know that I wasn't imagining things. I reached down, pulling the door closed slowly, carefully, and as I did, something caught my eye. A shadow, a flicker of movement, right at the edge of my vision. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Nothing out of the ordinary. My heartbeat quickened, my pulse pounding in my ears. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of fear brewing inside me. But something felt wrong. The air was thicker now, charged with an unsettling energy. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown anymore, it was the feeling of being watched. I closed the door completely and locked it, my hands shaking as I slid the bolt into place. The house felt too quiet, too still. I needed to distract myself, to do something to shake the sensation of unease that clung to every corner of the room. I retreated back into the living room and sat down on the couch, trying to focus on something, anything, to take my mind off what had just happened. I scrolled through my phone mindlessly, trying to find some sense of normalcy. But then, it rang again. I froze, my blood running cold. The screen displayed the same unknown number, and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to pick up. I was terrified. What if it was the same voice? What if it was something worse? But something inside me urged me to answer. A feeling I couldn't explain, a compulsion. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling. "Hello?" My voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end was different this time. It was lower, more distorted, like it had been altered in some way. "You opened the door." The words were cold, void of any emotion, as if they were stating a fact. I froze, the blood draining from my face. How could it know that? How could anyone know? I hadn't spoken to anyone since the first call. I hadn't. "You shouldn't have done that." "Now you've triggered it," the voice continued, growing more menacing, a hint of something darker lurking beneath the surface. I tried to respond, but my throat was dry, my voice caught in my chest. The voice was calm, too calm, as if it had seen this all before. "It's already inside. It's already here," the voice whispered. Then, it added something that made my stomach drop. "Look at the mirror." I felt my blood run cold. The mirror? I glanced across the room to the large, ornate mirror that hung above the mantel. I had always found it a bit unsettling, its old, cracked frame, the way it reflected everything a little too perfectly, as though it captured more than just the surface of things. I had never liked it, but I hadn't thought about it in years. I hesitated. My fingers clutched the phone tighter, as if somehow it could protect me from whatever was happening. The voice on the other end of the line didn't wait for a response. "It's too late now." "It's already in the reflection," it said, its tone dropping to a whisper. "It's in the glass. Don't look. Don't look into the mirror." But I was already moving before I realized what I was doing. The words from the voice echoed in my head, but my body was acting on its own accord. I stood up and walked toward the mirror, my steps slow, deliberate, each one feeling heavier than the last. I reached the mirror, my reflection staring back at me in the dim light. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Just me. My tired eyes, my disheveled hair, the dark circles beneath my eyes. But then, the air around me seemed to shift. A chill swept through the room, and I felt it, the weight of something dark pressing in from the edges of my vision. The reflection in the mirror began to distort, its edges warping as if the glass itself was alive, breathing. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, convinced I was seeing things. But when I looked back into the mirror, it wasn't me anymore. The face staring back at me wasn't my own. It was a shadow, a twisted version of myself, its features contorted into something unrecognizable. The eyes were dark, hollow, as if they had been drained of all light. The mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong, too wide, too sharp. And then I saw it move. The reflection, it was moving on its own. The figure in the mirror smiled, and the smile spread unnaturally, its mouth stretching wider than humanly possible. The voice on the phone was still in my ear, but it felt distant, like it was coming from miles away. You opened the door. Now it's free. Now it's coming for you. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, my eyes still locked on the mirror. The thing in the glass, it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. It was getting closer. And then, the door to the living room slammed shut. I spun around, my mind reeling, but there was no one there. No one in the hallway. No one outside. Just the empty house, the silence, the oppressive feeling of something watching. I was alone. Or so I thought. But in the reflection, I could still see it. The thing. And it was moving toward me. The figure in the mirror advanced toward me with every heartbeat. It wasn't simply an image anymore, it felt alive, a malevolent presence that seemed to bleed out of the glass, as if it were trying to claw its way into the room. My body went cold, frozen in place as I stared at the reflection. My mind screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. Every ounce of my being was riveted to the twisted face in front of me. The thing, it wasn't me, not exactly. It had my features, yes, but distorted, warped into something monstrous. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, its eyes wide and black, devoid of any humanity. The smile that spread across its face was impossible, stretching unnaturally, its lips curling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth that looked far too sharp. And then, it spoke. I'm coming for you. The words didn't come from the phone this time. They came from the reflection, as though the thing inside the mirror had found its voice. A hollow, rasping whisper that sent a shiver of terror through my entire body. My heart pounded in my chest. I stumbled backward, my body instinctively trying to escape, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. I reached for the phone in my hand, but it was shaking so violently that I could barely hold it. The voice on the other end of the line was still there, still distorted and eerie, but it seemed distant now, almost drowned out by the increasing noise coming from the mirror. You opened the door, it repeated. You should have listened. My mind was spinning. I felt like I was drowning, unable to think straight, unable to escape the nightmare unfolding in front of me. The thing in the mirror had stopped moving for a moment, but its eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking, unwavering. And that grin, it never left. It only grew wider, more malevolent, as if it was enjoying my terror. My body trembled as the silence stretched on, the only sound in the room my uneven breathing and the frantic beat of my heart. I had to do something. I had to escape, but where could I go? I couldn't run. There was nowhere to hide. I turned, glancing desperately around the room for something, anything, that might help. But all I could focus on was the mirror, the reflection that now seemed to consume everything. The space behind me, my own living room, felt unreal, like it had been replaced by the dark, twisted world inside the glass. Suddenly, the thing in the mirror moved again. It wasn't just stepping toward me anymore. No, it was reaching toward me, its long, bony fingers stretching out from the surface of the glass, as if the mirror was no longer a barrier. I screamed and stumbled backward, slamming into the coffee table, sending it crashing to the ground. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. The fingers came closer, inching toward me. I could almost feel the cold, as though the mirror itself was pulling at the warmth from the room, draining everything of its life. The thing's smile stretched even further now, impossibly wide, its teeth glinting in the dim light. It was right there, so close I could almost touch it. And then, a bang. The door behind me exploded open with such force that I was knocked off balance, tumbling to the ground. I whipped around, expecting the worst. Something had broken in, but there was nothing there. The door was wide open, the hallway dark and empty. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. I had no time to think. I couldn't let the thing in the mirror reach me. I had to get out of here. I needed to get away from it, from this house, from whatever had started this nightmare. Without thinking, I bolted toward the door, my feet slipping on the hardwood floor as I sprinted down the hallway. I reached the front door and threw it open, breathing in the cool night air. The quiet outside was almost mocking, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. I stepped onto the porch, barely able to catch my breath, my hands still shaking uncontrollably. I looked back at the house, at the darkened windows, the shadows that seemed to move and shift even though the night was still. I shouldn't have left the house. I knew it, deep down. I knew it was wrong. But I couldn't stay there, not with that thing in the mirror. A cold wind blew through the air, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to ward off the chill. But the phone in my hand rang again. I almost didn't answer, but then I realized I had to. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just keep running. I lifted the phone to my ear, the dread creeping back into my chest. Hello? My voice was barely more than a whisper, and I could feel my stomach twist as I spoke. Are you outside? The voice on the phone asked, still distorted, still chilling. I swallowed, looking around the yard, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I'm outside. I don't know what's happening. What is it? The voice was quiet for a moment, as if it was calculating something. Then it spoke, its tone flat and emotionless. It's following you. It won't stop until it has you. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I looked around again, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The world felt off-kilter, as if reality itself was slipping out of place. Who is it? I asked, my voice trembling. What is it? The response was sharp, like a warning. Don't go back inside. Not yet. You have to find a way to break the connection. If you don't, it'll never let you go. The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what I had just heard. It was too much. The door had opened. The thing was real. It was in the mirror. It was in my life. And now, it was following me. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I just knew that if I went back inside, I might never leave again. The thing would be there, waiting. I glanced back at the house, the dark windows staring at me like empty eyes. It was inside. And it was waiting for me to return. I stood frozen on the porch, my fingers still gripping the phone like a lifeline, my heart hammering in my chest. The world felt unreal, like I was standing at the edge of some twisted nightmare, unable to wake up. The air around me was thick, heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in, something that wasn't just in the house anymore. I glanced nervously at the door behind me, the darkness inside the house like a gaping mouth, ready to swallow me whole. Every part of me screamed to run, to get as far away from the house as possible. But I knew, deep down, that running wouldn't save me. I couldn't escape it. It had already crossed into my world. I couldn't just leave. I couldn't. I wasn't sure what was worse, going back into that house or staying out here, exposed, with no plan, no idea what was coming next. The wind whistled eerily through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding, a whisper of something just out of sight. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to think. I needed to find a way to break the connection, whatever it was that was tying me to that thing in the mirror. If the voice on the phone was right, I couldn't just ignore it. I had to do something. I turned around slowly, looking at the house again, this time more carefully. The shadows in the windows were darker now, more pronounced, as if they were moving, shifting. I couldn't tell if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or if someone, was really watching me from inside. My legs felt heavy as I approached the front door again. I stood there for a moment, unsure, as though the house itself was daring me to come back inside. My breath hitched to my throat, but I steeled myself. I have to face this, I told myself. I have to know what's happening. I have to stop this. I pushed the door open cautiously. It creaked as it swung inward, the sound sharp in the quiet night. The interior was dark, only the faintest sliver of moonlight creeping in through the windows. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the light. The stillness was suffocating. I took one step inside, then another, the door closing quietly behind me. The silence seemed to press in, the air thick with the weight of something unseen, something waiting. I turned toward the living room, the space where I had seen that horrible reflection just moments ago. The mirror. I had to confront it. I had to break the connection. But as I moved toward the living room, something caught my eye. A shadow. It was moving on its own, gliding across the floor, far too fast to be human. It darted toward the hallway, disappearing into the dark. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. The fear I had been trying to suppress came rushing back, the cold fingers of panic gripping me. I forced myself to take another step. I need to get to the mirror. When I entered the living room, I immediately spotted it, the mirror. It stood there, reflecting nothing but the darkness. The frame, which had once looked so ordinary, now seemed warped, its edges jagged and crooked. As I approached, I felt the air grow colder, the temperature dropping in a way that didn't feel natural. I didn't want to look into it, but I had no choice. I had to face whatever this was. The thing was still inside the glass. I could feel it, pulling at the very fabric of reality, bending the world around me. I stared at the mirror, watching the shadows shift in its reflection. But this time, something was different. The glass began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by something beneath. The figure, that thing, was no longer just a reflection. It was pressing against the glass, trying to break through. I could hear it now, a low, guttural growl coming from the other side. The thing's hands, long and bony, reached toward me, its fingers scraping against the glass with a sound that made my skin crawl. I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the thing that had been haunting me. Its eyes, black and endless, locked with mine. And then, it smiled again, that grin, widening, stretching beyond what should have been possible, as though it wanted to devour me whole. A voice, not from the phone but from the mirror itself, whispered into my ear. "You can't escape. You opened the door. Now you belong to it." The words sent a surge of fear through me, and I finally broke the spell. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but the mirror seemed to reach out toward me, as though the glass had become a doorway, a portal pulling me in. I knew I couldn't let it pull me closer. If I did, I'd never escape. I turned and ran. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash. I didn't stop to look. I didn't stop to think. My feet carried me down the hallway, through the kitchen, and toward the back door. It's not real. It's not real. I repeated the mantra over and over in my head, trying to fight off the overwhelming panic. But the closer I got to the back door, the more the house seemed to shrink around me. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with something unholy, something that wasn't supposed to be here. I reached the door and flung it open, my breath ragged as I stepped into the yard. But then, I heard it. The sound of something scratching, dragging across the floor. The same sound I had heard from the mirror, but now it was coming from inside the house. I turned, my heart nearly stopping. In the distance, I saw it. A shadow, growing larger, its outline becoming more defined, more solid. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was here, in the real world, and it was coming toward me. I ran. I didn't care where. I just ran. The thing in the mirror was no longer a ghost in the glass. It was free. And it was hunting me. I ran blindly, my feet pounding the earth, the sound of my breath ragged and desperate. Every step I took felt like a race against time, against the relentless presence that was closing in on me. The air around me seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, thick and suffocating, as if the night itself was turning against me. The shadows, once familiar, now felt like living things, twisting and shifting, stretching out in unnatural ways, following my every move. I had no plan, no destination. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance between me and the house as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, the feeling of being hunted, of being pursued, never left me. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet had turned against me, pulling me back toward that cursed place. Behind me, the house loomed in the distance, its windows like hollow eyes watching me, its dark silhouette standing stark against the night sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from within, waiting for me to stop, to falter, just for a moment. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over my shoulder, heart racing, expecting to see the thing from the mirror, that thing, pursuing me, its distorted form creeping up from the shadows. But there was nothing. The yard was empty. The house was silent. Am I imagining it? No. I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Not now. I kept running, but my body was beginning to fail me. My legs ached, my chest felt tight, and every breath was a struggle. The weight of the fear, the suffocating dread that had been building inside me for days, was now taking its toll. I was starting to slow down, my steps growing heavier, as though the very air was thickening, pressing against me. And then I heard it. A soft rustling sound, almost like fabric brushing against itself. I froze. It was coming from behind me. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, expecting the worst. But when I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing. Just the empty yard, the same dark shapes of trees and bushes that had been there before. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, but there was only silence, deep, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. It's just my mind playing tricks, I told myself, forcing myself to turn back and start running again. But as soon as I did, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. I spun around once more, and my stomach dropped. A figure. A tall, thin figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person. Not really. It was a shadow, a shape that shouldn't have been there. Its outline was wrong, too sharp, too angular. It was as though the darkness itself had taken form, stretching and shifting in ways that no human body ever could. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to move, its edges blurring and twisting like smoke. And then it stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't make a sound as it moved, its presence filling the air with an almost tangible weight. My heart raced, and I felt a coldness settle over me, something far colder than the night air. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt paralyzed, as if the very sight of it had stolen the ability to move from me. It was too late. The figure was almost upon me now, its shape becoming more defined, more solid, its outline stretching and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The world around me seemed to fade, the trees, the grass, the sky, all of it blurring into nothingness, leaving only the figure standing before me. And then it spoke. The voice was distorted, twisted, nothing like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't the voice on the phone, but it was close enough to make my blood run cold. You should have listened. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was coming from everywhere, inside my head, in the air around me, like it was part of the very fabric of reality itself. The shadow, the thing, took another step forward, its form now towering over me. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me, as if it were trying to absorb me into itself. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was nothing left but the overwhelming feeling of dread, the crushing certainty that it was going to end here. You opened the door, the voice whispered again, the words sinking into my mind like poison. Now you belong to it. You belong to me. I couldn't move. I couldn't fight. It was like my body had stopped responding, my limbs heavy, my mind clouded. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, impossibly long fingers curling into claws. Just as the cold touch of its hand was about to reach me, everything stopped. The world around me shifted, like the fabric of reality itself was being pulled and torn. The figure, the shadow, seemed to ripple, its shape warping and distorting. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I stood there, panting, trembling, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The fear, the terror, was still there, crawling under my skin, but the thing was gone. The yard was empty again. I stumbled backward, disoriented, my mind racing to make sense of what had just occurred. Had it been real? Was it still out there? Was it waiting for me to go back inside? To return to the house? I turned around, looking at the darkened windows of the house behind me. The shadows inside were moving again, but I couldn't be sure if it was just my fear, my mind playing tricks. All I knew was that I couldn't go back inside. Not yet. I had to find a way to end this. To stop whatever had been unleashed. But deep down, I knew that the thing in the mirror, the thing I had brought into my life, wasn't finished with me yet. It was just getting started. And it wasn't going to let me go. Not ever. Have you ever received a letter from a place you're sure doesn't exist? It started simply enough. One Tuesday, I found an old, unaddressed postcard lying in my mailbox. There was nothing extraordinary about the card at first glance, a picture of a bustling city square with cobbled streets, old-fashioned buildings towering on either side, and people going about their day. It looked like any other touristy postcard, except for one glaring detail. The city, as it was described on the back, wasn't on any map. "Welcome to Grendale," it read. "A city that mirrors your life, though never quite the same. Come see it, but be careful what you bring with you." I frowned, my fingers gripping the card a little tighter. The name didn't ring a bell. I'd never heard of Grendale before. The card itself didn't have a return address, only a vague postmark that was nearly illegible. It seemed out of place. But it wasn't the city that unsettled me, it was the strange sense of familiarity in the description. The more I read, the more it sounded like my own life, yet twisted, distorted. The description spoke of a small cafe on the corner of Elm and 7th, where a man in a brown jacket always sat alone, watching the world through the window. A little too closely, it seemed, as if waiting for something. I knew that cafe. I'd passed it countless times on my walks through town. There was always a man sitting there. He never seemed to leave, always staring out the window, his face expressionless. The postcard went on the 5th floor of a crumbling apartment building, a door leads into a darkened room. The air inside is thick with dust and old memories, though none of them were your own. I froze, my hand trembling slightly as I read the words. That description, too, felt strangely familiar. There was a building just down the road from my apartment. I'd never thought much of it before. It was a rundown place, with peeling paint and windows that never seemed to open. But the 5th floor. I had always felt something odd about that floor, a heaviness in the air that made my skin crawl whenever I passed by. I hadn't thought about it in years, but now, reading these words, I felt a chill creep up my spine. Who had sent this postcard? How did they know about my life? The back of the card ended with a cryptic sentence, "Every step you take here echoes in another world. Be careful, for the city always remembers." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The more I thought about the postcard, the more it gnawed at me. It was as if this Grendale was somehow tied to my reality, a parallel city where everything was just a little off, a little darker. But it didn't make sense. How could that be? I tried to shrug off the unease that settled in my chest. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. But the postcard didn't stop there. Every week, without fail, another one would arrive. Each one more detailed, more specific, each one echoing my own life, but with unsettling, impossible changes. At first, it was just small details, things I could dismiss as coincidence. A street I walked down regularly was described on the card, but the people and places around it were different, blurred and unfamiliar. But the descriptions grew more personal, more disturbing. The postcards began to describe things that hadn't happened yet, moments in my life I hadn't experienced, but felt as though they were about to unfold before me. Events from my past, things I had long since forgotten, began to reappear in these postcards, twisted into strange, unsettling versions of what I remembered. One card spoke of a night I hadn't lived yet, a nightmare that was still to come, where I would find myself in the middle of a crowded square in Grendale, running from something that couldn't be seen, something that was waiting just beyond the corner, watching me. That's when I started to feel the pressure in my chest every time I looked at the cards. The weight of their prediction, the slow crawl dread up my spine. The fear wasn't about what had already happened, it was about what was coming next. Every week, the postcards grew darker, more cryptic. I tried to stop them. I tried to throw them away, but they always found their way back to me. One card arrived, scrawled in messy handwriting, "You will be here soon. We're waiting for you." I couldn't understand. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Or was I somehow trapped in this strange version of reality, a city that existed somewhere just outside my reach, mirroring my life, but twisting it into something unrecognizable? The worst part was that I couldn't stop it. There was no way to break free from these postcards, from the city they described. It was as though Grendel had already begun to seep into my world, and I was powerless to stop it. And then, one night, I saw it. I was standing at the window, looking out into the dark streets, when I caught a glimpse of something moving across the alleyway. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure, someone standing in the shadows, their face obscured, watching me. I blinked, and they were gone. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't a person. It was the same figure I had seen in every postcard. A figure who was always there, waiting for me. I felt my heart race in my chest. It was no longer a matter of if. It was only a matter of when. The city was coming for me, and I could already hear the echo of its footsteps in my life. The following days felt like a blur, but the postcards continued to arrive, each one more unsettling than the last. I couldn't ignore them anymore, not when everything in them seemed to be inching closer to my own life. I began to obsess over the details, tracing every word, every sentence. There was no doubt in my mind something strange, something sinister was happening. But what? Why me? And why this city, Grendel? One evening, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the latest card. It was different this time, darker, more urgent. "They know you're here," it read. "We can feel your presence. The boundary is thinning." I shuddered. The sense of dread I had been pushing away for so long was now impossible to ignore. The feeling of being watched was more than a passing thought. It was as if something was closing in on me, pressing against the walls of my apartment, watching my every move. I thought about the man from the cafe again. He had been sitting there, day after day, just staring out the window. His empty, distant expression had always unsettled me. But now, with the postcards fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, was he part of this strange world that seemed to be encroaching on mine? Had he been waiting for me all along? The postcards weren't just disturbing because of their content. They had a presence of their own, a weight to them that I couldn't quite explain. They felt alive. Each one made my hands shake as I touched them. Each one seemed to leave a lingering, oppressive sense of foreboding in the air long after I read them. My apartment, once a safe place, now felt foreign to me, as if the very space around me was shifting, becoming something I didn't recognize. I had to know more. I couldn't just let this happen without understanding what was going on, without finding a way to stop it. The next postcard was the worst yet. It was a picture of Grendel at night, narrow streets, darkened windows, the faint glimmer of streetlights barely cutting through the gloom. It was the same city, but there was something deeply wrong about the image. A shadow, too large to be a person, loomed in the background, its features indistinct, like it was only half-formed. And on the back, the message was clear: "Tonight, you will walk into Grendel. We will find you." I couldn't breathe as I read those words. This wasn't just some bizarre coincidence anymore. The city, Grendel, was coming for me. The postcards were no longer just a warning, they were a call to action. Grendel was pulling me in, piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, not knowing exactly where I was going, but knowing that I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep letting these postcards control me. The feeling of being trapped was suffocating, and it was only getting worse with every passing minute. As I stepped out into the street, a cold wind hit me, and the city felt different. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the entire world had come to a standstill. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight, not a single person. My footsteps echoed in the empty streets, a stark contrast to the bustling, crowded places I remembered. I walked faster, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence around me. Every corner seemed to lead me deeper into an unfamiliar world, a world that didn't quite make sense. The buildings seemed to stretch higher than they should, their outlines blurred, as if they were caught halfway between two realities. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the city itself was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. And then I saw it. The cafe. It was just as it had been described in the postcard, the same man in the brown jacket, sitting alone by the window, staring out at me. His face was familiar, though I couldn't place where I had seen it before. He didn't seem to notice me at first, his eyes vacant, lost in thought. But as I approached, his gaze shifted toward me, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something shift in his expression. Something recognizable. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. He was no longer just a strange figure from a postcard. He was a part of this place, part of whatever was happening to me. I took a hesitant step toward the door of the cafe, my mind racing with questions, but something stopped me. A noise. A distant sound coming from behind me. It was a low, guttural hum. A voice, barely audible, whispering my name. I froze. The sound was coming from everywhere, filling the air, swirling around me like a swarm of insects. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was undeniable. It was like the city itself was speaking to me, urging me to listen, to follow. But I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to step into whatever this place was, whatever this nightmare had become. I had to find a way out, a way to escape the pull of Grindale. The figure in the cafe didn't move, didn't speak. But I knew, somehow, that he was waiting for me to make my choice. I turned around and fled into the night, the shadows following me, closing in with every step. As I ran, I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape from Grindale. It was already inside me, inside my life, inside my mind. And it was only a matter of time before I would be drawn in completely. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute more suffocating than the last. The streets I ran through were empty, yet every corner felt like a trap, each shadow a silent observer, watching my every move. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as I pushed myself forward, but it was no use. No matter how fast I ran, the sense of dread only deepened. I had to get away. But from what? What was Grindale? Why was it so intent on pulling me in? The postcards, the man in the cafe, the whispers, everything was connected. But how? My mind swirled with questions, each one more confusing than the last. I needed answers, but I couldn't even begin to comprehend the nightmare I had stumbled into. I stumbled down an alleyway, the air growing colder as I turned the corner. Something felt wrong. The sounds of the city were muffled here, as if the world had gone silent, as if the alley had been sealed off from everything else. I looked around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There were no streetlights here, no signs of life. Just darkness and the weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling, and pulled out the latest postcard. The image on the front was the same, a desolate city street under the cover of night, but something was different this time. The shadow in the background was no longer just a vague figure, it had formed now. A face. And that face was staring right at me. I gasped, the air suddenly thick with fear. I couldn't breathe. The postcard slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the ground at my feet. It felt like everything in the world had just come to a halt. I was no longer in control. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, had become unbearable. I turned, my heart racing, and saw something shift in the alley ahead. A figure. A man, standing at the far end. I didn't know how he had appeared there, but there he was, watching me. It was the same man from the cafe. His expression was no longer vacant. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw something unsettling in them. It was as if he knew me, knew everything about me. "You've been looking for answers," he said, his voice calm but filled with an eerie finality. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. I don't understand," I stammered. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his footsteps making no sound on the pavement, as if the world around us had gone completely still. "You were always meant to find this city," he said softly. "It's in you. It's been in you for a long time." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath me was beginning to shift, the walls of reality warping and stretching. My head spun with confusion, and I could feel the weight of the darkness around me closing in, pressing in from all sides. "But I don't want this," I whispered, taking a step back, my voice barely audible. "I didn't ask for any of this." The man's expression remained unreadable. "It doesn't matter whether you wanted it or not. You're here now, and you'll never leave." His words cut through me like a knife, chilling me to the core. I wanted to scream, to run, but the fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move. And then, without warning, he was gone. Just like that, the man vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the alleyway. I couldn't even hear his footsteps fading away. The silence was absolute. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and the world around me felt like it was suffocating me. What had just happened? Was it real? Was any of this real? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding my thoughts. I had to leave. I had to get out of this city, out of this nightmare. I turned and ran again, not knowing where I was going, just knowing that I couldn't stay here any longer. The postcard had fallen to the ground behind me, but I didn't dare look back. As I ran, I realized something. Greendale was more than a city. It was a reflection. A reflection of my own mind, my own fears, my own insecurities. The postcards weren't just a warning, they were a reflection of the way I saw myself, twisted and distorted through the lens of terror. And the man, he was me, too. A version of myself I had never wanted to face. I didn't know how much time had passed, but when I finally stopped to catch my breath, I found myself in a part of the city I didn't recognize. The buildings were taller now, looming over me like dark, oppressive giants. The streets were quieter, emptier. I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, when something caught my eye. A building in the distance, one that looked familiar, too familiar. It was an old church, the one I used to visit as a child. I had never seen it in this city before, but now it was standing right in front of me, as if it had always been there, waiting. A chill ran down my spine as I took a tentative step toward it. The door to the church creaked open as if inviting me in, and I felt the pull once again. Something was waiting for me inside. I didn't know if I was ready, but I had no choice. I stepped forward, and the door slammed shut behind me. And then the world went dark. The silence inside the church was suffocating. It felt as if time itself had stopped, leaving me suspended in an endless moment. My eyes strained to adjust to the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows, casting eerie, fragmented patterns across the cold stone floor. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and old wood, as though this place had been forgotten by the world for years, if not longer. I stepped forward cautiously, each footstep echoing louder than the last. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows stretched out like dark fingers, reaching for me. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. The church was impossibly quiet, not a single sound to break the oppressive stillness. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, just a rustle in the air. But then, clearer. A voice, low and distant, like a far-off murmur, almost unintelligible, but somehow familiar. I froze, straining to catch the words. "You're here, finally." The voice echoed through the empty church, sending a shiver down my spine. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking, breathing, and the sound of my own breath now seemed too loud in comparison. My eyes scanned the dark corners of the church, but there was nothing. No one. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. This place, this city, it was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't understand. The postcards, the man, the whispers, they were all part of something much bigger than I could fathom. And it was clear now, I wasn't just running from a city. I was running from myself. I moved toward the altar, instinctively, as though my feet were guided by an unseen force. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of inevitability grew. My heart raced, a knot tightening in my chest. I had to stop this. I had to escape. But the closer I got, the more the whispers intensified, until they were no longer just whispers, but voices. Low, mocking, as though they were speaking directly to me, waiting for me to understand. "You've always known, haven't you? You've always known this was your destiny." The words stung, cutting through the fog in my mind. My pulse quickened, and I felt my knees go weak, as if the weight of the truth had just hit me all at once. I shook my head, trying to deny it. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." The voices grew louder, a cacophony of distorted, overlapping sounds, like a broken radio, each one pulling at my sanity. And then, through the noise, I heard a new voice, a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You've been here before. This is where it all started." I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The floor beneath me seemed to tilt, and I caught myself just in time, bracing against the edge of the altar. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, what I was feeling. I looked up, my eyes searching the room in desperation. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the back of the church, just beyond the light of the stained glass windows. It was him. The man from the cafe. But this time, he wasn't standing motionless. This time, he was moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. His face was expressionless, but his eyes, they burned with something deep, something that felt ancient. And as he took another step closer, I realized something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just a stranger. He was me. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over me with a force I couldn't escape. The man wasn't just a person. He was a reflection, a distorted version of myself. The fear, the confusion, it was all a part of me. Grendel was a reflection of my own mind, twisted and warped, pulling me deeper into my own subconscious. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes never leaving mine. His lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You can't run from yourself," he said, his voice cold and final. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free, to fight, but I couldn't. I was trapped in this city, trapped in this nightmare. And the worst part was, I knew now that I had always been here. This city wasn't something I had stumbled upon by accident. It had always been a part of me, buried deep in my mind, and now it was forcing its way to the surface. I felt my knees buckle again, and this time, I didn't fight it. I sank to the cold stone floor, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the rough surface, trying to steady myself. The man, the version of me, watched silently, as if waiting for me to understand. "You're not going to wake up," he whispered. "There's no escape." There never was. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't wipe them away. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The city, the postcards, the man, everything was starting to blur together in my mind. It wasn't just a place. It was a reflection of everything I feared, everything I had tried to hide from myself. And as the darkness in the church deepened, I understood one terrible truth: Grindale wasn't just a city. It was my prison. I closed my eyes, my head spinning. Maybe there was no way out after all. But then, just before the world went black, I heard one final whisper, the voice from the postcards. "You can leave, but you'll never be the same." And I knew, deep down, that whatever came next, I would never be whole again. The city had claimed me. I don't know how much time passed after the darkness swallowed me whole. I drifted, suspended between the past and present, between reality and the nightmare that Grindale had become. Every time I tried to open my eyes, I saw only a blur of light and shadow, flickering in and out of focus. My body felt weightless, like I was floating just above the ground, too exhausted to move, too afraid to wake up. The voice, the whispering presence that had followed me from the postcards, was gone now, but the heaviness in the air remained. I could still feel it, creeping around me like a dark cloud pressing down on my chest. Then I heard a sound. A door creaking open, slow and deliberate, followed by the shuffle of footsteps across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. My eyes snapped open, and I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt like lead. I was still inside the church, still surrounded by the cold, damp walls that seemed to close in on me with every passing second. The figure, the man who had been me, was gone, but I could still feel his presence, lingering like a shadow in the corner of my mind. I tried to call out, but my voice failed me, as if the air itself was thick with silence, pressing down on my throat, suffocating my words before they could escape. The footsteps grew louder, and I turned my head, fighting to focus. There, at the end of the aisle, standing just beneath the stained glass windows, was a figure. Tall, indistinct, their features hidden in the shadows, like a silhouette carved from darkness itself. It wasn't the man. It couldn't be. The figure took a step toward me. Then another. And another. Closer and closer, until I could hear the soft shuffle of their feet against the stone floor. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest, too afraid to move. Too afraid to do anything. And then, the figure stopped. I could feel their eyes on me, though I couldn't see their face. But in that moment, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that this wasn't someone I had ever met. This wasn't just some stranger from the city. This was something else. Something far worse. "Why are you here?" the figure asked, their voice low and gravelly, like the rasp of dry leaves scraping across the ground. I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. The words were trapped inside me, locked away behind a wall of fear and confusion. The figure took another step forward, their footfall soft but heavy, as though each movement was weighed down with meaning. And with each step, the air seemed to grow colder, the silence thicker. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the figure continued, their voice now almost a whisper. "The city. The postcards. The truth." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The truth. The truth about Grendale, about the twisted city that had become a part of me. The city that was somehow more real than my own life. I had seen it, yes, but I hadn't understood it until now. "You are the city," the figure said, stepping closer until they were standing directly in front of me. "You've always been. Every postcard you've received, every moment you've lived here, it was never about the city. It was about you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure's voice echoed in my mind, reverberating through my thoughts like a cruel reminder of everything I had feared. "You are the architect," the figure whispered. "And this city is your creation." My mind reeled. The city, the postcards, the strange events that had unfolded around me, they weren't coincidences. They were pieces of something much larger, something I had created, whether I had meant to or not. Grendale wasn't just a place. It was a manifestation of my own fears, my doubts, my deepest anxieties. "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "This isn't possible. I didn't create this. I didn't ask for this." The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. "Of course you didn't. But you've always known, haven't you? You've always known that this city is a reflection of your soul. You've tried to escape it, to forget it, but it will always be with you. Because you can never escape yourself." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't wipe them away. I didn't have the strength. The weight of everything I had experienced, everything I had done, or failed to do, weighed me down, crushing me beneath the realization that I had been living in a nightmare of my own making. The figure's hand reached out, gently brushing the air in front of me. I flinched, instinctively recoiling, but there was nowhere to go. The church, the city, it was all closing in on me. There was no escape, no way out. "You can leave," the figure said, their voice soft, almost comforting. "But you will never be the same." I closed my eyes, feeling the coldness of the stone beneath me. My mind screamed for release, for freedom from this place, from these twisted memories. But I knew deep down that I couldn't escape. Not truly. Because Grendale was inside me. And no matter where I went, it would follow. The footsteps faded away, leaving me alone in the silence once more. But I knew that silence would never come again. Because I was no longer just a visitor in this city. I was its creator. Its prisoner. And it would never let me go. It was supposed to be a normal day at work, nothing out of the ordinary. The office building I worked in wasn't particularly special. A typical concrete structure in the heart of the city, home to dozens of businesses just like mine. I never expected to find anything unusual, not in a place like this. But that day, something strange happened. I stepped into the elevator as usual, pressing the button for the 5th floor, where my office was located. The doors slid shut, and I leaned against the wall, checking my phone as the elevator hummed quietly, ascending steadily. But then, just as I reached the fourth floor, something unexpected occurred. The elevator stopped. A small jolt, followed by a moment of eerie silence. I looked up, confused. The elevator display flickered, and the number -1 blinked on the screen. I stared at it for a moment, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. There was no -1 floor in the building. I knew that for a fact. I'd been working there for years, and I had memorized the floor plan. This was impossible. Before I could even think of pressing the emergency button or checking the floor selection panel, the elevator doors opened. I half expected to see an empty hallway or an awkward maintenance closet, but instead, I saw a dimly lit corridor stretching out before me, with doors lining both sides. A strange chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stepped out of the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the silent hall. The walls were painted a dull, yellowish color, and the lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor. I turned back to the elevator, but the doors had already closed behind me, leaving me standing there with no way to return to my familiar office. It didn't make sense. Where was I? I walked down the corridor, glancing nervously at the closed doors. They didn't have any labels, no signs indicating what rooms they led to. The air smelled musty, like something long forgotten. I moved cautiously, my footsteps hesitant against the cold, uninviting floor. Then, I heard it. A faint sound, at first, like a distant rustling. Maybe the wind, or perhaps a door creaking somewhere. But as I continued down the hallway, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was unmistakable now. Someone was walking behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The corridor remained empty, the flickering lights casting their long shadows across the walls. I could hear the sound again, closer this time, footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a jog, not sure what I was running from, but feeling the urgent need to escape. The hallway stretched endlessly, like a maze with no end in sight. I passed more doors, each one closed tight, their surfaces cracked and worn, as if they hadn't been opened in years. The footsteps grew louder still, matching my pace, as though the unseen presence behind me was toying with me, staying just close enough to remind me that it was there. I turned a corner, desperate to find a way out, but the hallway continued on, an unbroken stretch of darkness and silence. Then, I heard a voice. Low, guttural, and chilling. You shouldn't have come here. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't familiar, yet it echoed in my mind like a twisted memory. I tried to speak, to scream, but my throat was tight with fear, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper in the suffocating silence. The footsteps stopped. I didn't move. I couldn't. And then, the voice came again, even closer this time. I'm the one who's been waiting. I felt the presence behind me, closer than ever. I could almost feel the air shift, like something dark was closing in on me from every side. My legs were shaking, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it seemed to drown out every other sound. The hallway stretched on forever, but I knew, deep down, I would never reach the end. Not unless I confronted whatever waited for me in the dark. My hand reached out toward the nearest door, and just as my fingers brushed the cold metal handle, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, shuffling toward me. I whipped around, but once again, there was nothing there. Nothing except the darkness. and the sound growing closer still. I tried to ignore the creeping sense of terror that was rising in my chest. My mind raced, searching for some logical explanation for what was happening. The building had to be under construction, or perhaps there was a maintenance area on this mysterious -1 floor. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The voice I had heard, the footsteps, and the cold, unnatural air pressing against my skin, none of it felt right. I yanked the door open, desperate to find some refuge from the eerie hallway, hoping for even the smallest hint of familiarity. The door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, and I quickly stepped inside. The room was pitch black, and I stumbled slightly, my hand shooting out to catch myself. There was no light in here at all, and I couldn't even tell if it was an office or a storage room. I strained my ears, listening for any sounds from outside the door. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching, stalking from the shadows. My heart was pounding in my ears as I took a few cautious steps further into the room, trying to make sense of the oppressive silence. And then, just as I was about to turn back to the door, I heard something else. A soft scraping sound, like something heavy dragging across the floor. I whipped around, my eyes desperately trying to adjust to the darkness, but I could see nothing, only the vague outline of the walls and the faint reflection of light from the hallway that barely reached into the room. The dragging sound grew louder. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows shifting unnaturally as if they were alive. A chill ran down my spine, and my instincts screamed at me to leave, to run and never look back. But I couldn't move. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low hum. It was mechanical, rhythmic, like the hum of an old, malfunctioning machine, and it seemed to be coming from all directions. Then, something even more horrifying happened. The air grew warmer. The humming turned into a whisper, soft at first, but quickly growing louder until it was all around me, inside my head. The words weren't clear, but I could make out a few sounds. Familiar ones. Fragments of sentences. I saw, "You shouldn't escape." My body tensed, the words reverberating in my mind. I didn't understand, couldn't understand. It felt as though the room itself was alive, shifting and closing in, like the walls had a pulse of their own. I could hear the steps again, but this time they were not just behind me. They were beside me, ahead of me, and the room, it felt smaller. The floor beneath me felt like it was moving, like it was shifting slowly beneath my feet. The walls were warping in on themselves. The scraping returned, now accompanied by a soft, gurgling sound as if something was trying to speak to me from the depths of the darkness. I turned, desperate to find an escape, but the door I had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall, identical to the ones that surrounded me. Panic surged through me. I slapped my palms against the wall, feeling the rough, cold surface beneath my hands, but there was no way out. No way back. The room was alive with strange, ominous sounds. My breathing was coming in shallow gasps, each exhale louder than the last, and I was certain that whatever was in this room was waiting for me. The whispers came again, closer this time. It was almost as if they were speaking directly into my mind. "I told you not to come here." The voice was clear now, an unfamiliar, distorted tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I staggered back, my head spinning as I fought to understand what was happening. My heart hammered in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to escape, but the room had swallowed me whole. Suddenly, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, there was a flash of light, a blinding, stark white. And in that moment, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the room. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its face was obscured by shadows. It had no distinct features, just a blank, shapeless form that loomed there like an embodiment of the darkness itself. I froze, unable to move. It didn't speak, but its presence alone was enough to paralyze me with fear. I knew it was watching me, feeling me, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices whispering in my ear. They weren't words anymore. They were a low, guttural hum, a single note of terror vibrating through the air. And then I saw it. It was moving toward me, the darkness gathering around it like a storm, enveloping the room. The scraping returned, louder now, and the figure seemed to grow taller, its outline becoming clearer, but more distorted, more inhuman. I tried to move, but my legs refused to cooperate, as if they were frozen to the floor. And then I heard the voice again, close enough that it felt like it was inside my head. "You're too late." I couldn't breathe. The words echoed in my head, the voice, utterly alien and cold, piercing through the haze of panic that clouded my thoughts. My body trembled uncontrollably, as though my nerves had been stretched too thin, but still, I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, like they were cemented to the floor. The figure was still coming closer, its shape writhing in the shadows, shifting like it wasn't fully solid. With each step it took, the air grew colder, the floor beneath me seemed to pulse with unnatural energy. I could hear it now, a soft, rhythmic hum that reverberated through the walls, like the beating of a distant heart. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my mouth was dry, the words stuck somewhere deep inside me. It felt like the room itself was swallowing me, like the darkness was sinking into my skin, into my very bones. The scraping sound, like nails dragging across a chalkboard, was growing louder, sharper, and I could feel it vibrate in my chest. My heart thudded faster, each beat too loud in the suffocating silence that clung to the room. The figure paused, just a few feet away. I couldn't make out its face. There was no face, no eyes staring at me, but I could feel its gaze, cold and invasive, like it was staring into my very soul. I wanted to run, but the room seemed to stretch, expanding and contracting around me, making it impossible to tell where I was, or how to escape. I blinked, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something in the corner of the room. A flicker of movement, too fast to catch, like a shadow racing across the wall. I wasn't alone. The whispers returned, louder, frantic. "Get out! Get out now!" The voice was different this time, desperate, pleading. It sounded like it came from the walls themselves, as though the entire room was alive, trying to communicate with me. I could feel my pulse racing, each beat thudding painfully in my temples. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure moved. It wasn't a simple step forward. It seemed to fold in on itself, its shape bending unnaturally, contorting through the air like something not meant to exist. It was at my side in an instant, and the coldness that washed over me was unbearable. My skin felt like ice, my breath caught in my throat. The figure reached out, its long, twisted fingers brushing the air just in front of my face. It was so close now that I could almost feel the weight of it, the presence of something far beyond my understanding. The light flickered once again, casting the room into fleeting glimpses of stark, cruel illumination, showing me the shape of its monstrous form. "Do you want to leave?" The voice came from nowhere, yet it filled every corner of the room. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The air grew heavier, more suffocating. I could feel the walls pressing in on me, the narrow corridor of the room closing in tighter with every passing second. The cold was unbearable now. I was frozen, trapped in this place, surrounded by the oppressive presence of something that shouldn't exist. And then, just as I thought I would break, the lights went out. Darkness. Utter, complete darkness. The silence was deafening. For a few seconds, I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. It was as if the world had disappeared, leaving only me in a void, suspended in nothingness. I couldn't think. I couldn't feel. But then I heard it. A soft, distant sound, faint at first, like the scraping of nails against metal. And then it grew louder, closer, until it became unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and yet far too loud for such a small space. My breath caught in my throat again, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The footsteps were growing closer, but they weren't my own. They were coming from the direction of the door, or what used to be the door. I knew, deep in my gut, that whatever was making those footsteps was coming for me. And then, just as quickly as the darkness had swallowed me, the lights flickered back to life. But everything had changed. The room was different now. It was no longer the same dim, oppressive space I had stumbled into. The walls were cracked, worn, as if the place had been abandoned for years. The floor was covered in dust, and the faint smell of mildew filled the air. The once pristine office space had turned into a forgotten ruin. And in the center of the room, there was a single object, a chair, turned towards the wall, as if waiting for someone to sit in it. And standing behind it, a figure. Not the same figure from before. This one was different, its shape somehow more human, more familiar. I blinked. It wasn't possible. I had seen this figure before. It was me. The reflection of my own face stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The eyes were hollow, the skin pale, stretched thin. It grinned, an awful, knowing grin that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. And then it spoke. "You've been here before," it whispered, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "And you'll be here again." I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. The room was closing in on me, the figure advancing step by step, its smile widening with every movement. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let this happen. But before I could move, the world around me shifted once again, the walls trembling, the air warping. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, I was back at the elevator. The doors slid open, and I stepped out into the sterile, lifeless lobby of the building. I thought I was safe. But when I looked down, I saw the faintest trace of dust on my shoes. And the same cold voice whispered from somewhere behind me. "You never left." I couldn't move. The air felt heavier than ever, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted around me, bending into something I couldn't comprehend. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the dark hallway still stretching on forever, the figure following me like some ancient nightmare refusing to let go. But the lobby was empty. Silent. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything. The hallway. The figure. The twisted, hollow version of myself. But then, as I took another step forward, I felt it again, the cold, oppressive weight of something watching me, waiting for me to slip up. It was in the air, thick and suffocating, like it was wrapped around me, tightening with every breath I took. I tried to shake the feeling off, to convince myself that I was just tired, that I had to be. After all, the elevator doors had opened into the familiar lobby. I was back where I started, wasn't I? But then I saw it. A small scrap of paper was lying on the floor in front of the elevator. It looked like it had been dropped carelessly, as though someone had discarded it in a rush. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. It was a postcard, the kind you send from a distant place, a place I had never visited. The picture on the front was an image of a city, familiar yet strange. There was the same crooked skyline I had seen in the visions before, but something was different. The streets were twisted, the buildings distorted. In the foreground, there was a shadowy figure standing in front of a darkened window, the eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the same figure I had seen in the basement. I turned the postcard over, my heart sinking as I read the message on the back. "You can't leave. Not yet." My mind screamed in panic, but my body remained frozen. The words felt like they were branded into my brain, each letter, each line, like a command from something far beyond my understanding. I shoved the postcard into my pocket, my hand shaking, and rushed out of the building. The sunlight outside felt harsh against my skin, but it didn't bring relief. The world seemed wrong. The familiar streets looked faded, like a dream I couldn't fully grasp. I could feel it now, the same oppressive weight, the feeling of being watched, followed. I needed answers. I needed to know why all of this was happening. I went straight to the building manager's office, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what I had experienced. I burst in without knocking, and the manager looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. But there was something strange in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. I need to know about the building," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "The elevator, the basement, the -1 floor. There's something down there. Something wrong." She blinked slowly, her gaze turning cold. "There's no -1 floor. That doesn't exist." I stared at her, disbelief flooding my mind. "No, it does exist. I was there. I saw it. She cut me off with a sharp, unsettling smile. "You didn't. Trust me, you didn't." Her voice dropped lower, and her expression shifted into something unreadable. "You're not the first to claim such things." I froze, the words hanging in the air like a dark omen. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "This building, it's been here longer than you realize. People come and go, but some never leave. Sometimes, the walls remember things they shouldn't." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, remember?" She stood up, moving to the window and peering out. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Things happen here. Things that the building itself collects. If you're not careful, it might decide you're part of the collection." I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was as though everything I had seen, everything I had experienced, was part of a twisted pattern that had been playing out for years, maybe even decades. And I was trapped in the middle of it. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with a strange pity. "You should leave while you still can. This place doesn't let go easily." But I couldn't. I couldn't walk away without knowing the truth. "Tell me what's going on," I demanded, my voice shaking with desperation. "Tell me everything." The manager's eyes darkened. "I can't. But you should know one thing. The -1 floor, it's not a place. It's a memory." The room seemed to tilt slightly, as though the very air was shifting, warping, pulling me into a reality that felt less like the world I knew and more like a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then she added something I'll never forget. The basement, it remembers you. The words rang in my ears long after I left her office, and they stayed with me as I walked down the quiet, empty streets. The world around me was unchanged, but I wasn't. Something had shifted inside me. I could feel it, the pull of the building, the tug of whatever force it was that had left its mark on me. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As I looked down at the postcard in my pocket, I could feel the eyes of that twisted figure watching me from the darkness. And I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter how far I went, I would never truly escape. I don't remember how I ended up back at the building. It feels as though the very ground pulled me toward it, dragging me against my will, even though every part of me screamed to stay away. Maybe it was the postcard. Maybe it was the words from the manager. Maybe it was the nagging sense that something vital was missing from my understanding, like a piece of a puzzle that, once found, would unlock everything. I don't know what drew me back. All I know is that when I arrived, the building was quiet. Too quiet. The hum of city life was absent, the usual sounds of people moving in and out of the building, the rush of traffic, gone, as though the world had forgotten this place existed. I stood in front of the main doors, staring up at the dull, lifeless facade. It was just a building. But now, every crack, every creak in its structure felt deliberate, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. The elevator doors slid open before I even pressed the button. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The numbers above the door flickered. Floor 1. Floor 2. And then, without warning, the light on the display flickered and went blank. I felt the chill again, the same weight in the air that had plagued me since the first time I found myself in the basement. It seemed like the elevator wasn't moving at all, just standing still in the dark. The faint sound of my heartbeat was all I could hear, echoing off the walls, faster and louder with each passing second. And then, the floor indicator flashed again. It was -1. The doors opened, and I was standing in front of the same long hallway I had seen before, the walls lined with closed doors, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. The scent of dust and decay hung in the air, and it felt colder here. The distant hum of the building systems sounded muffled, as though the walls had absorbed it all. I stepped out of the elevator, my footsteps quiet on the old, worn tiles. The hallway stretched ahead of me, impossibly long, each step taking me further from everything I knew, closer to something I couldn't yet comprehend. I felt a presence again, not in the form of a figure, but in the walls themselves, like the building was alive and watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I walked down the hall, my hand brushing the wall for support. It felt like it was pulsing beneath my fingertips, as though it was breathing. Then, I stopped. There was a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others. Not just in appearance, but in feel. The air around it was darker, thicker, as though it was drawing the light toward it. I didn't want to open it, but I did. Something inside me compelled me to turn the handle. The door creaked open. The room was different. Unlike the sterile, empty rooms I had passed, this one was filled with old furniture, overturned chairs, and what looked like dusty files scattered on the floor. There was a window, but the glass was covered with a thick layer of grime, the view blocked by shadows. I stepped further inside, my heart pounding. In the far corner of the room, I saw something moving, something I couldn't quite make out at first. It was small, shuffling, but then it stopped, and I realized it was a figure. A person? I couldn't tell. It was hunched over, almost as if crouching, their form obscured by the shadows. I called out, my voice shaky. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. But then I heard it. The sound of soft breathing, labored and uneven. I stepped closer, cautiously, my pulse racing. The figure didn't move. I reached out with a trembling hand, and then, just as I was about to touch it, the figure turned, revealing its face. It was me. The same eyes. The same face. But twisted, as if seen through a broken mirror. The skin was pale, almost gray, and the features were distorted. The mouth, stretched into a grin that didn't belong, opened, and the voice that came out wasn't mine. It was a rasping, hollow version of it. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, the voice reverberating in my skull. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, my body frozen in place. The figure reached out, its hand stretched toward me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, the room went silent. No more breathing. No more movement. Just the oppressive stillness. But then I heard something else, a sound that wasn't mine, something distant. A voice calling my name. It was faint, muffled, like it was coming from far away, but it was familiar. It was my own voice. And it was calling me from the elevator. Without thinking, I ran. I ran back down the hallway, through the lobby, and into the elevator. The doors closed behind me, and I pressed the button for the ground floor, my hand shaking so badly I almost couldn't press the button. The elevator began its descent. Floor 10. Floor 9. And then, it stopped. The doors didn't open. The lights went out. Everything went dark. I was trapped. And then I heard it again, the voice, calling my name, but this time it was coming from the elevator itself. The walls of the elevator seemed to close in on me, suffocating me, the darkness pressing against my chest, as though it was alive. And then, the voice stopped. The elevator doors opened. I was back. Back on the ground floor, as though nothing had happened. But I knew that the basement, the figure, the voice, they hadn't been a dream. They were real. And they would never let me go. I left the building that day, and I never looked back. But the postcards still come. Every week. The same city. The same twisted reflection of my life. And every time I look at them, I hear the whisper. The voice calling my name. And I know that one day, I'll have to return. It was late in the evening when the phone rang. I was sitting in my dimly lit living room, flipping through an old book I had found in a second-hand store earlier that day. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythm almost soothing in the silence. I picked up the phone without looking at the caller ID, thinking it was a wrong number or maybe a telemarketer. But when I answered, there was no voice on the other end. Only static at first. And then, faintly, I heard it, something that didn't belong. A child's voice. "Help me, please." The words were soft, almost lost in the static. But I could hear the fear in the voice, the desperation. It sounded young, too young to be playing a prank, too innocent. The voice continued, barely audible but distinct. "I don't know where I am. Please. I'm scared." My heart skipped a beat. I thought maybe it was a recording, some sort of hoax. But something about it didn't sit right. It felt real. I tried to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. "Hello?" I called into the receiver. "Who is this?" The line went dead. I stared at the phone in confusion, the receiver cold in my hand. Was it a prank? Maybe someone had recorded it and played it back. But why would they choose to call me, of all people? I hadn't heard of any children going missing lately, and the voice sounded too real. Too familiar, almost. I placed the phone back on its cradle, but the chill that had settled in my chest remained. The moment the phone clicked into place, I felt an odd compulsion to go outside, to walk around. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I was just trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had come over me, or maybe it was the lingering echo of that child's voice. Either way, I needed to clear my mind. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the crisp night air. The streets were quiet, the usual hum of the city muffled by the distance. The street lights cast long shadows across the pavement, the world around me bathed in a soft, yellow glow. I walked aimlessly, my feet carrying me through familiar streets, but something felt different. The further I walked, the more disconnected I felt from everything. The houses, the shops, even the cars, they all seemed distant, as though they were part of another world entirely. And the more I walked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had shifted. I turned a corner and froze. There it was, in front of me. The school. I hadn't even realized I'd walked so far. The school stood there, dark and imposing, a relic from the past. I remembered it well, though it had been years since it had been torn down. The building was gone now, replaced by a shopping center and apartments, but in front of me, it was as if time had folded back on itself. The old brick walls were there, the windows dark and broken, the playground silent and empty. It was just as it had been when I was a child. But something was off. The air felt heavier here, as if the very ground beneath my feet was thick with the weight of memories long buried. I stepped forward, drawn to the place I never thought I would see again. And then I heard it. The sound of a school bell. It echoed through the empty playground, sharp and clear. The bell. The one that rang every time we went to class, every time we left for lunch, every time we went home for the day. It shouldn't have been there. The school had been demolished years ago, torn down brick by brick, and yet, there it was. I shook my head. I must be imagining things. Maybe the wind had carried the sound from somewhere else. But no, there it was again, ringing louder this time, as if the building was still standing, alive with activity. I couldn't look away. The sight of the school in front of me, the sound of the bell, it all felt so real, yet so impossible. My pulse quickened, and I took a step forward, unable to resist the pull. Another step. And then another. I felt the cold stone of the old schoolyard under my feet, the uneven ground that had been there so long ago. And then, the faint sound of footsteps. Childish footsteps running across the pavement. I froze. The footsteps were getting closer. Then I heard it again, the voice from the phone call. "Help me." It was coming from the school. From inside. The door to the building was ajar, creaking on its hinges as if inviting me in. Without thinking, I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was colder here, the darkness thicker, suffocating almost. The walls were lined with old lockers, some hanging open, others rusted shut. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the smell of dust and mildew filled my nose. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I was hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But the further I walked, the more the world around me seemed to warp, as if it was bending, reshaping itself to fit some unseen force. Then, the door slammed behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. The hall was silent again, but the voice, it was still there. "Please, help me." I turned, trying to follow the sound, but it was coming from everywhere. The walls seemed to pulse, the ceiling above me shifted in ways it shouldn't have. And as I moved forward, the shadows grew deeper, more menacing. The further I went, the more the school seemed to distort, its very structure changing, as if it were no longer bound by the rules of time and space. And then, in the distance, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A classroom door, its windows cracked and dark. The same classroom where I had sat years ago. But now, it was different. Behind the door, something moved. And the bell rang again. I didn't know why I had walked inside. There was something magnetic about the old building, something I couldn't resist. As the door slammed behind me, my breath hitched in my throat. The silence was suffocating. My heart was racing now, thumping against my chest as if trying to break free. The corridor was long, stretching ahead of me in a way that didn't feel right. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling away in places. It was exactly as I remembered from my childhood, yet it wasn't. The colors had faded, and there was a dampness in the air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked down the hall. The lockers, once brightly colored with student artwork and stickers, were now covered in rust. Their metal doors were either ajar or hanging off their hinges. The smell of mildew was thick, almost suffocating. The atmosphere here was not just cold, it was wrong. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but all I could hear was the ringing of that bell, so faint, yet undeniable. It echoed through the halls, bouncing off the walls like a cruel reminder of what was supposed to be a long-forgotten place. Then I heard it again. The voice. "Please, help me." It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakably there. The voice of the child from the phone call. The one I couldn't forget. My hands trembled, my body frozen in place. Where was it coming from? I could feel it. The sound of footsteps again, but this time closer, louder, and more hurried. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see someone there, anyone. But there was nothing. Just the dark, endless hallway stretching out into nothingness. I took a step back, my foot hitting the floor with a loud creak. The sound felt too harsh in the silence. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. I expected an answer, but the only thing I heard was the distant sound of more footsteps, faster this time. I glanced to my left, to my right, but no one appeared. It was as though the building itself was playing tricks on me. Without thinking, I started walking. I had no plan, no idea what I was doing. My feet carried me forward as if they knew the way. I passed classroom after classroom, each one seemingly frozen in time. Desks were arranged in neat rows, but the air felt heavy in each room. The doors were all closed, save for one, just ahead. The classroom door was cracked open, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hall. The faint sound of shuffling echoed from within, and the same voice, now strained and desperate, whispered from the shadows. "Please, help me." I hesitated, my body refusing to move, my feet planted firmly on the floor. I wanted to run, but something held me there, a pull that I couldn't explain. Something in that voice kept me rooted to the spot. The room behind the door was silent now. The shuffling had stopped. I tried to steady my breathing, but I couldn't. There was something wrong. The very air felt charged, alive with an energy I couldn't understand. The shadows shifted slightly, as if they were watching me, waiting for something. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The classroom was empty. Empty, but wrong. The desks were overturned, papers scattered across the floor as though something had violently torn through the room. The windows were cracked, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that I didn't recognize. The boards at the front of the classroom were marked with chalk, but the writing was twisted, unreadable, except for one word scrawled in the center. Help. I stepped back, a cold shiver running down my spine. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what I could see or what I couldn't. The room felt alive, like it was waiting for something. For me? Or for whoever else had been here before me? I turned around, scanning the hall. I couldn't stay in this room, it was too much, too unsettling. But the moment I stepped away from the doorway, something caught my eye. At the far end of the hallway, a shadow moved. A figure, tall and thin, emerged from the darkness, its shape barely visible, but unmistakably human. My breath hitched. I could see its outline now, moving closer. My feet felt like lead, my body frozen, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. Who is that? I whispered to myself, my voice barely escaping. But no answer came. The figure stopped in the middle of the hallway, just a few feet away. Its face was obscured in darkness, but I could feel its presence. The shadows around it seemed to stretch, twisting in unnatural ways. And then I heard it again. The voice. This time, it was clearer, more urgent. Please, you have to save us. I didn't know if it was coming from the figure or if it was something else, but my heart raced. My body screamed at me to run, to get out of this place, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in this nightmare, unable to escape. The figure slowly tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. Then, in a voice that was far too calm for the situation, it spoke. You shouldn't have come here. The air grew colder. Before I could react, I heard the bell ring again, louder, more insistent. The echo reverberated through the building, shaking the very walls. The figure turned and started walking away, fading into the darkness, its footsteps now a dull thud against the silence. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move. What was happening to me? Why was I here? The silence returned, broken only by the distant, never-ending toll of the bell. And in that moment, I knew that whatever had happened to this school, whatever was happening now, was far from over. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the edge of a nearby desk to steady myself. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The words of the figure echoed in my mind, you shouldn't have come here. It felt like a warning, a truth that I wasn't ready to face. The bell tolled again. The sound seemed to resonate through the entire building, shaking the very foundation beneath me. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, pulsing with life. I could almost feel the weight of the school pressing down on me, trapping me in this nightmare that I had never asked to be a part of. I turned to the exit, hoping to leave, but the hallway stretched out before me in an impossible way. What had been just a few steps down now seemed endless. The door to the classroom I had just entered slammed shut on its own with a deafening crash. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't know if I was more afraid of what I had seen or what I couldn't see. Then, I heard it. The faint sound of a child's voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Please, don't leave me." It came from the far end of the hall, beyond the classroom, in the direction where the figure had disappeared. The voice was so desperate, so broken, that it pulled at something deep within me. I had to go. I had to find this source, to understand what was happening here. But my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring into the shadows ahead. The air was thick with tension, the smell of old books and mildew mixing with something darker, something heavier. The walls around me seemed to close in, pushing me toward that voice. It wasn't just the sound I feared now. It was the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting for me just beyond my reach. The bell rang again, louder this time, almost deafening. The sound rattled my bones, making my teeth ache. My pulse raced in time with the tolling, each ring pulling me deeper into the unknown. With a force that surprised me, my body finally moved, propelled by a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. I walked forward, my steps slow, measured, as if I were walking through a dream. The hall felt wrong, its walls shifting, stretching, as though the building itself were alive and aware of my presence. I passed another classroom. The door was wide open, but the room inside was completely dark, no lights, no movement. It felt like a trap. I couldn't look inside, yet I couldn't look away either. Something about the darkness in that room was pulling at me, trying to draw me in. But the voice, soft, pleading, terrified, came again, this time clearer, sharper. "Help me, please." I took another step, and the floor creaked beneath me, the sound startling in the otherwise silent building. I glanced down and saw a faint trail of dust rising from the floorboards, swirling in the dim light that filtered through the cracked windows. It was getting colder. My breath misted in front of me, the chill seeping into my bones. I could almost feel the temperature dropping, the air thick with something ancient and heavy. The smell of decay was stronger now, mingling with the faint odor of something burning, paper, wood. I didn't want to know. I stopped again, my eyes drawn to the end of the hall. A door stood there, a single wooden door that looked different from the others. It wasn't aged like the rest, wasn't covered in dust or grime. It was pristine, untouched, as though it had just been placed there. And from behind it, I could feel something waiting for me. The child's voice came again, closer now, desperate. "Please, it's too late. Don't open the door." The word struck me like a slap, a warning I couldn't ignore. The door was dangerous. I knew it now. Whatever was behind it, it wasn't meant to be found. But I was already walking toward it. I reached out with trembling fingers, the doorknob cold and slick under my touch. As I turned it, the hinges groaned, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to echo in the empty hallway. The door swung open slowly, its creak louder than it should have been, like a scream breaking the silence. The room inside was small, cramped, and dimly lit. At first, I couldn't make out anything, just the shapes of furniture and piles of papers. Then, my eyes adjusted, and I saw the walls covered in drawings, childish sketches, hastily drawn and frantically scrawled across the walls in thick black lines. The same symbols I had seen earlier, the ones I couldn't understand. And then I saw her. A girl, no older than 10, sitting on the floor in the center of the room, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging over her face. Her eyes were wide with fear, locked on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Don't listen to them," she whispered, her voice a rasp, like she hadn't spoken in years. "You need to leave. It's not safe." I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. Something about her seemed wrong, unnatural. Her presence felt like a shadow, like she wasn't entirely here. Like she was trapped between worlds. Before I could say anything, the door behind me slammed shut. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that I jumped back. My heart raced, and I spun around, panicked. The hallway was gone. In its place was nothing but blackness, an endless void that stretched in every direction. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they had all disappeared. The only thing left was the room with the girl and the faint, flickering light from an unknown source. The girl's voice broke the silence again, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was something worse. "It's already too late." The darkness swallowed everything. The room with the girl, the flickering light, it all felt like an illusion. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. I looked at the girl, her wide eyes never leaving mine, but there was something else there now. Something darker. Her lips moved, but the words were no longer a whisper. They echoed in my mind, distorting, twisting, as if they were spoken from another time. "You're part of it now." I wanted to scream, to run, but the air was too thick. The oppressive silence around me pressed in, suffocating, like the very walls were closing in. I stepped back, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The blackness stretched on, swallowing the hallway I had once known, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. I turned back to the girl, my throat dry, the weight of her gaze nearly unbearable. She hadn't moved, but her eyes, they were changing. Darker. Hollow. As if something, someone, was inside her, controlling her, feeding off her fear. "Why are you here?" I forced the words out, my voice hoarse. "What is this place?" Her mouth twitched into a small, sad smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know a secret that you will never understand. A smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "It's always the same," she murmured. "You come, and the bell rings. You think you're leaving, but you never do." The sound of the bell tolled once more, shaking the very air around me. It vibrated through my bones, and I could feel it in my chest, an insistent, unyielding force. I tried to cover my ears, but it didn't help. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if it were alive, urging me to act, to run, to do something, anything. But there was nowhere to go. I glanced around, hoping for an escape, but the room had begun to distort, its edges bending and warping. The walls twisted, becoming grotesque versions of what they had been. The drawings on the walls seemed to shift and move, their black ink crawling like insects, creeping toward the center of the room. The girl's voice grew louder in my mind. "You can't leave. You've already heard it." Her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I felt them claw at my mind, tearing at the fragile grip I had on reality. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. I don't understand. What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving me. "This is where the past comes to rest," she whispered. "And where the future begins." A shiver ran down my spine as the words settled in, cold and chilling. The walls continued to shift, their once familiar shapes now becoming strange and alien, like they didn't belong in this world. Then, a door appeared in front of me. It was unlike the others. It wasn't part of the room, as if it had materialized out of nowhere. It was made of old, withered wood, with an intricate brass handle that shimmered in the dim light. The moment I saw it, I knew it was the way out. But as I stepped toward it, I felt the air grow heavy once again. The girl's voice, now a soft murmur, reached me one last time. "Don't open the door. You don't know what's waiting for you." I hesitated, my hand inches from the handle, feeling the weight of her warning. But the bell rang again, louder, more urgent. The sound was so powerful now that it made my teeth rattle on my skull. The pressure in the room was unbearable, and my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I grabbed the handle and twisted it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a long corridor, empty, silent. But I knew what was waiting for me. I had felt it, heard it in the girl's voice, seen it in the shifting walls. Whatever was on the other side of that door was not a place of safety. It was the beginning of something worse. The bell rang once more, louder now, as if it were following me, mocking me, reminding me of the choices I had made. I stepped through the door, the darkness swallowing me whole. And then, everything went still. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. I was trapped in a void, suspended between time and space, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. I blinked, trying to make sense of the situation, but as I opened my eyes, I realized this wasn't the hallway I had just left. The walls were different. The ceiling was too low. The floor beneath me felt wrong, as if I were standing on something that wasn't meant to be touched. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of mold and old paper. And then I heard it. The bell. It rang again, the sound echoing around me, vibrating through the room. The very air seemed to pulse with it, suffocating me. It was as if it were coming from everywhere, surrounding me, pushing me deeper into the dark. I tried to move, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor, unwilling to obey. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowering, the shadows stretching like fingers reaching out to claim me. And then, a voice whispered in the darkness, soft, almost gentle. "You're back." The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The voice was like a ripple in the silence, disturbing the stillness that had enveloped me. It was faint, but it carried an unsettling familiarity. Something deep within me trembled at the sound, though I couldn't place where I heard it before. I forced my legs to move, the heaviness in the air making each step feel like wading through thick water. As I turned around, the oppressive darkness pressed in around me, pushing me further into the small, dimly lit room I had unknowingly stepped into. And then, standing in the center of the room, was a figure. It was a child, no older than 8 or 9, dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform. The pale, ghostly skin and dark eyes were the only details that stood out in the suffocating gloom. There was something wrong with the child, though, something unnatural about the way he stood there, unmoving, watching me with an intensity that chilled me to my core. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "You're back," the child repeated, his voice softer now, almost as if he were pitying me. "You shouldn't have come back. You can't escape it." The words didn't make sense. None of this made sense. I tried to shake the fog from my mind, but it clung to me, blurring my thoughts. The bell rang again, louder now, echoing off the walls, so loud that it felt like my head would explode. The child's gaze never wavered from me, and I could feel his eyes digging into my skin, reading my every thought. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what was happening, but I was too terrified to speak. "You've already heard the bell," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, like a secret. "That means you're part of it. You can't leave." The words echoed in my mind like a chant, looping endlessly. Part of it. I didn't understand what that meant, but a part of me, something deep down, felt as though I already knew. This wasn't just a random experience. This wasn't just a lost call from a school that no longer existed. It was something much darker. The child stepped forward, his small hands reaching out. The closer he came, the more the shadows around him seemed to grow, swirling in unnatural patterns, twisting and turning as if alive. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in on me, the space growing smaller and smaller, suffocating. The bell continued to toll, and with each ring, the shadows seemed to grow more powerful, more menacing. "You have to stay," the child whispered. "You're already here. You're already one of us." His hand was inches from my face now. I could see his small fingers trembling, but not in fear, in anticipation. And then it hit me. The bell. The sound. The school. The child. Everything, all of it, was a cycle. A never-ending loop that trapped anyone who entered, anyone who listened, anyone who dared to discover the truth. I had heard the bell. That meant I was already part of it. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, but the hallway stretched out before me, endless and twisting. Each turn I made led me to more darkness, more corridors, more empty classrooms. It was as if the building itself had come alive, folding in on itself, trapping me in its grasp. The child's voice echoed behind me, growing fainter with each step. "You can't leave," he repeated, the words now barely audible over the ringing bell. "You're never leaving." I didn't know how long I ran. My legs burned, my chest ached for air, but no matter how fast I moved, the darkness always followed. The shadows closed in on me, whispering, pulling at my mind. I stumbled, my foot catching on something unseen, and I fell to the floor. The sound of the bell seemed to shake the very ground beneath me, vibrating through my bones. I looked up, desperate, but the room had changed again. It was no longer the school, it was my apartment. The familiar, comforting space I had once known. But there was something wrong. The walls were closing in, the floor creaking as though the very building were coming apart. The shadows in the corners twisted into figures, their eyes gleaming with malice. The child appeared before me again, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those dark, hollow eyes. I felt his gaze pierce into me, deeper than before, as if he could see my very soul. "You can't run from it," he whispered, his voice distant. "You can never escape." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words crush me. The bell rang again, and I knew that I was trapped in this cycle forever. The darkness had consumed me, the school, the bell, the child, all of it. It was all one thing, one never-ending nightmare. And I was part of it now. There was no escape. I had already heard the bell. It was too late. Have you ever entered a place where time seems to stretch in unnatural ways, where the world around you doesn't feel quite real? I did, during a hiking trip that took me deep into the heart of a forest I had been warned about. But warnings are never enough when curiosity pulls you in. It started as a typical hike. I was in a small group, but we were a bit spread out, each of us following our own pace. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, and the trees towered above us like ancient guardians. The sun filtered through the canopy in uneven beams, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch on for miles. Birds sang overhead, and the rustle of leaves underfoot filled the space with an odd, calming rhythm. It was beautiful. Peaceful. That is, until I wandered off the path. It wasn't intentional. At first, I had simply taken a few steps off the beaten track, intrigued by an oddity in the forest floor, an old, half-buried stone that looked out of place among the roots of the trees. But when I looked up, I realized that the familiar sound of the others' voices had faded. The birds were silent, and the usual hum of nature had gone dead. The air felt heavier here. My breath came in shallow bursts, the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I paused, looking around, but there was no sign of anyone. No distant voices, no footsteps. Just an overwhelming stillness that felt wrong. I checked my phone. The screen was blank. The signal had dropped. Strange. The forest wasn't that far off from civilization. I took a few more steps, my feet crunching the dry leaves beneath me. Then, I noticed something. A symbol carved into the trunk of a nearby tree. It wasn't a shape I recognized, but there was something oddly hypnotic about it, something that made me want to step closer. As I moved towards it, I saw more symbols. Everywhere. Each tree, every rock, had markings on them like a forgotten language of some ancient kind. They weren't just random scratches, they were deliberate. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but something was wrong. My compass spun wildly, and the map's arrows shifted as if they had a mind of their own. The path I had been following no longer seemed to be on the map, and every direction I turned led me further into uncharted territory. A shiver ran down my spine. The wind had stopped, too. No rustling leaves, no faint breeze to cool my skin. Just oppressive stillness. I tried to shake off the feeling that was creeping up my neck. It's just a coincidence, I told myself. I've just gotten lost. That's all. But then I noticed something in the distance. A figure. At first, I thought it was one of the others. But as I squinted, I realized that it wasn't. The figure didn't move. It stood still, almost unnaturally so, in the center of the path, where the shadows seemed to darken even though the sky above was clear. I called out, but no sound came from my mouth. It was like the air had thickened to the point where sound couldn't travel. I tried again, this time shouting, but still nothing. The figure remained motionless, as if it were waiting for me to approach. I took a step back, trying to gather my thoughts. What was going on? This didn't feel like just a simple hike anymore. I felt trapped, not just physically, but mentally, like something about this place was bending reality itself. I turned to go back, but the landscape had changed. The trees had shifted. What was once a clear path was now a labyrinth of thick, gnarled trunks, each one marked with those same unsettling symbols. My heart started to race. The ground beneath me felt uneven, as if it was alive, shifting with each step. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A faint rustle, like footsteps, but too soft to be real. I froze. The air was thick, but I could almost feel something else now, something in the shadows that was moving, watching. I turned again. This time, the figure was closer. I hadn't seen it move. It shouldn't have moved, but there it was, inches away from where I had been standing just moments ago. Its shape was humanoid, but distorted, like it had been warped by the forest itself. The eyes, if they were eyes, stared straight at me, but they didn't belong to anything human. A cold chill washed over me. I tried to speak, to call for help, but nothing came out. The figure raised a hand, and in that instant, I understood that it wasn't just a person. It wasn't even a spirit. It was something far older, something bound to this forest, something that couldn't be explained. I started walking backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. My body was telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the very ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, holding me in place. The figure didn't move, but I knew it was getting closer. And then I heard something far worse than the silence. The trees whispered. It was a faint murmur at first, like the wind picking up. But then it grew louder, rising in a chorus of voices, as if the forest itself was speaking to me. You shouldn't have come. The words echoed in my mind, as if they were coming from the ground itself, from the trees, from the very air I breathed. I turned and ran. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that thing, from the whispers that clawed at my mind. My heart was racing, and I could barely catch my breath as I stumbled through the underbrush. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches of the trees stretching toward me like gnarled fingers, reaching to pull me back into its depths. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, but I couldn't stop. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was trying to hold me in place, but I pushed on, adrenaline coursing through me. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't just voices now. It was like the very fabric of the forest was alive and angry, telling me that I didn't belong, that I shouldn't have ventured this far. The words were growing more insistent, like a chant, an incantation that had been building for centuries. You shouldn't have come. My mind was spinning. I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. Everything around me was twisted, the trees contorted into shapes that no longer made sense. I couldn't trust the map, couldn't trust anything. The symbols on the trees were now everywhere, swirling and shifting, and I was sure they were following me, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. A crack of a twig snapped underfoot, and I froze. There was something else, someone else, moving in the shadows. The rustling was deliberate now, not just the wind or the animals. There was someone hunting me. I couldn't hear footsteps, but the sound of the branches moving felt deliberate. It was a sound I could feel deep in my bones. I whipped my head around, eyes scanning the shadows, but all I saw was darkness, thick and suffocating, pulling me further into the forest's heart. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. And then I saw it. Through the thick branches, I caught a glimpse of a figure, familiar, yet entirely out of place. It was the same thing from before, standing in the distance, motionless once again. Its shape had shifted even more, the features were harder to define now, as though the forest itself was wrapping around it, distorting it. It was so far away, but it felt closer than it ever had been. In a panic, I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and I fell to the ground with a heavy thud. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there, gasping for air. The forest didn't seem to care. The trees loomed above, pressing in on me. The whispers were now so close I could almost hear them in my ear, soft and cold, like the brush of a lover's breath. Help! Help me! It was the voice of a child. A faint, trembling voice that sounded so desperately real. It was coming from the direction of the figure. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to ignore it, to keep going, but the voice, it felt so real. It was like a plea from someone who was lost. A voice I couldn't ignore. I didn't realize that I had already begun moving again until my feet were carrying me toward it. Every step felt like I was being pulled against my will, my body acting on instinct, my mind screaming at me to stop. The figure in the distance was closer now, almost within reach. It was still motionless, its shape hidden by the trees and the shadows. The voice called again, softer this time. "Please, help." I could barely hear it over the whispers, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to get closer. I had to see what was asking for help. Something inside of me refused to let me turn back. The closer I got, the more I realized something was terribly wrong. The voice wasn't right. It wasn't a cry for help, but something deeper, more twisted. The edges of it seemed to fray, like the voice itself was being distorted by something dark. I pushed through the undergrowth, the brush tearing at my clothes, and finally emerged into a small clearing. There it was. The figure, standing as still as it had been before. It wasn't a person, I realized with growing horror. It wasn't even human. It was just a shape, a shadow of something far darker than I could comprehend. The forest seemed to be wrapped around it, like it was feeding off the trees, the ground, the very air. I couldn't move. The voice called again, more insistent now, and I realized it was coming from within the figure. "Help me, please." And then, suddenly, everything shifted. The trees around me groaned, the earth beneath my feet trembled. The figure in front of me seemed to distort even further, expanding, twisting into something that shouldn't exist. The shadows grew long, stretching unnaturally toward me, and the clearing was no longer just a place in the forest, it was becoming something else, something darker. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The figure took a step forward. I was paralyzed. My body was frozen, caught between the desire to escape and the inability to move. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming, and the voice grew clearer. "You're not supposed to be here." And then everything went black. When I woke up, it felt like I was floating, like the world around me had been suspended in a moment of pure, suffocating darkness. My mind was heavy, disoriented, struggling to make sense of where I was. The last thing I remembered was the figure, the whispers, the voice calling for help, and then the overwhelming blackness. But now, everything was eerily quiet. The oppressive silence felt thick, like a heavy blanket pressing down on me. I tried to sit up, but my body felt unnaturally stiff. The ground beneath me was cold, damp, and unfamiliar. When I finally managed to push myself upright, I found myself in the middle of the forest again. The trees were taller here, the space between them deeper, darker. The air felt heavy, thick with something ancient and forgotten. But everything was still. The wind had stopped, the usual rustling of the leaves, the sounds of birds or insects, they were gone. I glanced around, panic rising in my chest. Nothing made sense. I hadn't been here before. Hadn't I just been? I reached for my map, instinctively, but when I pulled it out, I froze. My map, wasn't the same. It was covered in strange, cryptic symbols, none of which I recognized. The landmarks were all wrong, the paths leading off into directions that didn't exist. The lines were jagged and warped, twisting in unnatural ways. As if the very landscape had been rewritten, bent to something otherworldly. And then I heard it again. A faint sound in the distance. A child's voice. "Help! Please help me!" I stood frozen, listening. The voice was quieter this time, weaker. It was so far away, but it echoed in my head, sharp and insistent. The voice sounded so real, so vulnerable, so desperate. It felt like it was calling to me, urging me to do something, to act. I couldn't turn away. Despite everything, despite the strangeness of this place, I had to follow that voice. I walked through the eerie forest, my footsteps slow and deliberate, the map clutched tightly in my hands. The deeper I ventured, the more distorted the surroundings became. The trees were different now, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The path beneath my feet was no longer a familiar trail. It was uneven, jagged, as if the ground itself was buckling under some unseen pressure. And yet, the voice persisted. It was growing louder. Please, help me. I moved faster, heart pounding in my chest. The atmosphere around me was oppressive. The shadows felt like they were watching, closing in with every step I took. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the deeper I went, the more I felt like the forest itself was alive. It was breathing, pulsing, as if it were aware of me, of my presence. I rounded a corner, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A figure, standing in the shadows. But it wasn't the same shape as before. This time, it was human, a child, a boy, standing motionless in the dim light. His face was pale, and his eyes, they were empty, dark voids. No pupils, no irises, just black. His body was thin, his clothes ragged, as if they had been worn for a long time. The moment I saw him, he turned toward me, and his lips parted, but no sound came out. The voice that had been calling to me earlier seemed to emanate from him, yet his mouth never moved. Help me. It was the same voice. The voice I'd been following. But now it was different. It was cold, distant, devoid of the vulnerability I had heard before. Something wasn't right. The chill in the air grew sharper, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wanted to turn away, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The boy raised a hand, his fingers stretched toward me as if reaching for something just out of my grasp. The air between us seemed to crackle, thick with something I couldn't see, couldn't touch. But I could feel it. It was wrong. So wrong. And then the shadows around him seemed to shift, the space around him bending, stretching, distorting. It was like the boy was a part of the forest now, a part of something much older and more terrifying than I could comprehend. Help me. I stepped back, but before I could turn, I heard something else, faint at first, but growing louder. A sound I couldn't ignore. It was footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking toward me. The sound was slow, deliberate. A soft, rhythmic thud against the ground. But it wasn't normal. It didn't sound like human footsteps. It sounded heavy, unnatural, as though something larger, more dangerous, was moving through the trees. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. The boy was still standing there, his empty eyes locked on me. But the footsteps, they were getting closer. Closer with each passing second. The air around me thickened, the shadows stretching longer, until the entire forest seemed to be closing in, folding over me like a trap. The whispering returned, louder than before, and it was no longer just whispers. It was a voice, a deep, guttural voice that didn't belong in this world. You shouldn't have come, it growled, and I knew, in that moment, that it wasn't just the forest speaking. It was something else. Something much darker. The figure in front of me, The boy smiled, and it wasn't a smile. It was a grimace. A jagged, horrific expression that didn't belong on a child's face. The shadows around him twisted and warped, reaching out like claws. I tried to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. The trees loomed, blocking my path, twisting around me. The air was too thick, too heavy to breathe. My legs felt like they were moving through mud. And then, through the darkness, I saw it, something worse than the boy, worse than the twisted trees. A massive figure, half hidden in the shadows, towering over everything. Its eyes burned like embers, glowing with an ancient, hungry light. It was waiting for me. It was waiting to take me. And for the first time since I entered the forest, I truly understood the danger. There was no way out. Not for me. Not for anyone who stepped into this cursed place. The Black Forest wasn't just a place. It was a trap. And now, I was its prey. I could feel the pressure in the air, thick and suffocating, as if every breath I took was dragging me deeper into the earth. The towering figure loomed just beyond the trees, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness like twin torches. I couldn't make out its full shape, but the sense of its presence was overwhelming. It was like something ancient and malevolent, something that shouldn't exist, something that had been waiting for me. The boy, still standing motionless with that grotesque grin on his face, seemed to vanish into the shadows, swallowed up by the forest's unnatural silence. But the footsteps continued to draw closer, slow and deliberate. I could hear them now, heavy, dragging steps, like the weight of something immense moving through the forest. I forced myself to move, desperate to escape, but my legs felt as if they were wading through thick, sticky mud. Every step was a struggle, my heart racing in my chest, the sound of it pounding in my ears. I could barely see the path ahead, the darkness surrounding me like a living thing, swallowing the light and distorting everything I thought I knew. The air was so cold now, I could see my breath. It wasn't just the forest that had changed, I felt like the very atmosphere itself was closing in, pressing against me. My feet dragged over the ground as the sounds grew louder, closer. The weight of the footsteps grew with each passing second, until it felt like the earth itself was shaking. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, a rustling sound, sharp and unnatural, cut through the silence. I spun around, every muscle tense, ready to flee, but there was nothing there. Only the trees, the darkness, and the footsteps. Closer, closer. I turned again, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, just past the trees. But this one wasn't human. It was taller than the boy, its limbs long and twisted, like something that didn't belong in this world. It didn't move like a person, it glided, shifting through the forest like a shadow, its form barely perceptible in the dark. But its eyes, they glowed, the same cold, empty fire as the boy's. My heart lurched, panic surging through me like electricity. There was no time to think. No time to plan. I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. I stumbled forward, pushing myself through the thick underbrush, branches clawing at my face, at my arms, my legs. The forest was closing in, the trees crowding around me as if they were alive, reaching out to grab me. But it didn't matter. I was running now, not caring about the way forward, not caring about anything except escape. I ran until my legs burned, my lungs screamed for air. I ran until the darkness threatened to swallow me whole, until every sound around me seemed to distort and twist into something unnatural. The whispering was back, louder now, rising up like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. They were words, not exactly, but a haunting hum that filled my head, making it hard to think, to breathe. The footsteps were behind me, closer now. So close I could hear the heavy, wet sound of them dragging through the forest floor. There was no way I could outrun this thing. There was nowhere left to go. And then, as if the forest itself had decided it was time to reveal its true form, everything went silent. The world around me froze. The whispering stopped. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. Maybe I had just lost my mind, running through this nightmare with no clear reason. But then the ground beneath me shifted. The earth groaned, the trees groaned. The space around me seemed to ripple, like the very fabric of reality was tearing. I looked up and saw something, no, someone, emerging from the shadows. It was not the boy. Not the towering figure. No. This was something far worse. The shape was massive, its body cloaked in darkness, its form jagged and twisted like an ancient tree warped by time and malice. Its eyes were not glowing, they were empty, hollow, voids of black that absorbed all light, all warmth, all life. The creature's head hung low, as if it had been waiting for me to finally come into its reach. It didn't move, but I could feel it. It was watching me. And then came the voice. Not from its mouth, but from everywhere. From the very ground beneath me, from the trees, from the air around me. You should not have come, it whispered, its voice deep, like the rumble of thunder beneath the earth. This place is not for you. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble again, shaking with a force that made my legs buckle. I fell to my knees, my chest tight, my heart racing so fast I thought it would tear through my ribcage. Run. The thought flashed in my mind like a bolt of lightning. I scrambled to my feet, the weight of the creature's presence pushing against me, dragging me back down. But I refused to give up. I wouldn't let it take me, not after everything I had already survived. The forest closed in around me as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but the need to escape, to survive, pushed me forward. But as I ran, something shifted. The trees were no longer just trees. The forest itself was alive, changing, warping. The path I had been following was gone, replaced by more twisting, tangled branches. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and the ground seemed to buckle beneath my feet with every step I took. I could hear the creature now, its footsteps, heavy, deliberate. And worse, I could feel it following me. It was in the air. In the very trees. Its presence surrounded me, suffocating me. No matter how fast I ran, no matter where I turned, it was always right behind me. My mind was beginning to break. The forest itself felt like it was pressing in on me, twisting time and space. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was something more, something alive. And as I ran, all I could think about was the creature's voice. You shouldn't have come. And it was the last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I was running. Time in the forest wasn't something I could measure anymore. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes bled into hours. It felt as if I had been running for eternity, trapped in a never-ending loop where the path shifted with each step I took, and the trees bent in on themselves like they were conspiring to keep me there. The air grew colder with every passing moment, and the mist thickened, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The whispering had stopped, but that didn't mean I was free. No, the silence was worse than the noise. It felt like a trap, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stumbled over roots and branches, my legs like lead, my body screaming for rest. But there was no rest. Not in this place. Not in the Black Forest. Behind me, I could hear it again, the soft, dragging footsteps. Not fast, not slow, but relentless, unchanging. It was there, stalking me. And I could feel its eyes on me, even though I didn't dare look back. The trees were starting to look different now. Twisted. Twisted in ways I couldn't describe. Their branches seemed to claw at the sky, their trunks bent and gnarled like they had been there for centuries, perhaps longer. But there was something more. Symbols. Symbols etched into the bark, glowing faintly, casting a sickly green light. Everywhere I looked, they were there. On the trees. On the ground. On the leaves. Symbols I didn't recognize. They pulsed in time with my heartbeat thumping in my chest, like they were alive. Like they were part of me now. And then, something shifted. The trees ahead parted just enough for me to see something, a shape in the distance. A clearing. It was small, barely visible through the thick fog, but it was there. A way out? Maybe. Without thinking, I pushed forward, my legs moving faster now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The clearing grew closer, the mist thinning just enough to let the faintest light filter through. I could almost make out the ground, the trees. The air felt different here, less heavy, more open. But just as I thought I might have escaped, I felt it again. That presence. The creature. It wasn't behind me anymore. It was in front of me. The air grew cold again. The fog thickened, swirling around me like a living thing. And then, from within the mist, I saw it. The creature. The one that had haunted me all this time. It was closer now. Much closer. It stood there, just at the edge of the clearing, its shadow stretching toward me like it was reaching out to grab me. Its body was a grotesque mixture of twisted limbs and dark, shifting shapes. The symbols that had been etched into the trees were now glowing brighter, flashing in rhythm with its movements. The creature's eyes were no longer empty voids. They were filled with something terrible. Something ancient. Something beyond my understanding. It spoke, its voice a low, rumbling growl that shook the very air. "You cannot escape," it said, each word sinking into my skin like a needle, its presence pressing down on me with unbearable weight. "This place will not let you go. Not now. Not ever." I backed away slowly, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But my legs refused to move. I couldn't run. Not anymore. The clearing wasn't a way out. It was a trap. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The air grew even colder, and I could feel the edges of my vision starting to blur. The trees around me seemed to close in tighter, the ground beneath me shifting as though it were alive and hungry. I was trapped. It was then that I noticed something. A figure. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the creature's presence, a small, shadowed form was standing there. It was watching me. Silent. Still. The boy. The same boy from earlier. The one who had warned me. He raised a hand, a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. And in that moment, I understood. The creature wasn't just hunting me, it was hunting us. It had always been hunting. I turned back toward the creature, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, and I knew then that there was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. The forest had claimed me. The last thing I heard, as everything around me blurred into the fog, was the voice of the boy, so faint, so distant. You are part of it now. And then, everything went black. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.